Chapter 282. Su Fengnian was only slightly absent-minded. Fortunately, he had Bai Hu's face in front of him, so he quickly came to his senses. But he still found it somewhat inconceivable. It was not difficult to find a beautiful woman around 70 coins, but the one in front of him was at least 90 coins. How could he be a man? Wasn't this a waste of natural resources? His Royal Highness was not like Li Hanlin, who had a penchant for men and women. Su Fengnian was not even interested in young prostitutes, let alone those creepy *Cs. There were many famous scholars in Gangnam-do. There were experts in Guangling who specialized in training them. When they were young, they were bought cheaply for a few dozen taels of silver. When they were 12 or 13 years old, they were sold at a sky-high price of 10 or even 100 taels of gold for the scholar officials and dignitaries to play with. This had become a common practice in the group of scholars in Jiangnan. It was regarded as a wonderful and elegant thing. The scholars were tired of competing with poems, songs, and gold, stone, and jade. It was not easy to usher in the golden age of peace, so they began to compete with the singers and beautiful maids at home. Su Fengnian carefully looked at this girl. Sure enough, her chest was flat and did not look like a woman. Murong Tonghuang was obviously accustomed to Su Fengnian's gaze. The corner of his mouth was cold. Was he trying to drive the wolf away by accident? The world was as black as all crows, and the one in front of him was not a good thing either. Su Fengnian had been in the flower bush for a long time, so he knew how to grasp people's hearts. He smiled and said, "Yes, I am indeed not a good thing." Murong Tonghuang, whose thoughts were seen through, became colder and stiffer. His body instinctively shrank back. Su Fengnian did not care and asked curiously, "It seems that you are not with the cavalry. What's going on? Is this a local tyrant robbing a woman?" Murong Tonghuang bit his lips and ignored this guy with a foreign accent. Su Fengnian turned his head and looked at the light cavalry that was chasing after them on the small path. With the Phoenix Battalion's horsemanship and the horses' leg strength, it was 90 against 20. There was a great disparity in the number of people on both sides. There was no need to worry about the outcome of the battle. If Yuan Meng couldn't eat it, he would be beheaded. As for the young machete man who killed decisively, Yang Qingfeng was proficient in the art of tracking, Xu Xiao had a variety of martial arts, and Ningame, the great halberd, the 10 white horse followers, and even Grandpa Wei said that he wanted to stretch his muscles and bones to participate in the encirclement. The machete man was ferocious, but he was still in a perilous situation. Su Fengnian was not worried that someone was trying to lure the tiger away from the mountain. After the battle at the reed marsh, the green and white lawn above his head would alert him if there was any movement within a radius of 10 li. Not only that, Su Fengnian had carefully selected 5 nimble and agile soldiers from the Phoenix Battalion to serve as roaming scouts, to ensure that they would be able to seize the initiative at the first opportunity. Su Fengnian asked calmly, "Who was the one who was taken away?" "I didn't see it clearly at that time. If you practice the vow of silence with me again, I won't care if you live or die when my men bring him back." Murong Tonghuang seemed to have been caught in his Achilles' heel. He hesitated for a moment and said, "My sister." Su Fengnian asked, "Then who was the one who took you?" Murong Tonghuang gritted his teeth and smiled nervously. He said with a cold face, "Have you heard of Jiangxi Longhu Jiangdong Xinyuan?" Su Fengnian pretended to be crazy and said, "Those old Taoists of Mount Longhu want to take you up the mountain? Do you want to be Taoist companions and practice the art of sex?" Murong Tonghuang turned his head away fiercely. He was too lazy to talk nonsense with this guy whose head was caught by the door. Su Fengnian smiled and said, "Jiangdong Xianyuan? That's great. Do you know that there's a woman called Xianyuan Qingfeng in this family?" Murong Tonghuang's mind was full of thoughts. He said in a flat tone, "Xianyuan Qingfeng is even more prestigious than the princess in Jianzhou." "Why? Did you come here because of her?" Su Fengnian, who had been lifting the curtain with the scabbard, laughed out loud and said, "Because of her? That's right, that's right. I'm about to fall in love with this woman." That's a good way to put it. That guy Wenhua must be rolling on the ground when he hears it. You know, When he was chased and beaten by this woman, he even flirted with her because she didn't shave her armpit hair clean. Murong Tongwang stared at this guy in a daze. Was there really something wrong with his head? Su Fengnian put away the embroidered winter and slowly let down the curtain. His stomach full of evil ideas began to ripple. They were actually the private soldiers of the Shenyuan clan. If they wanted to sleep, they could just hand over a pillow. If this crime of killing dozens of people from the escort agency was spread out, he wouldn't be afraid that the two provincial governors would be blinded. Right now, the provincial and county system was changing. The 30 or so provincial governors originally in the imperial court were all sharpening their heads, wanting to reach a higher level of enlightenment. During this period of time, it was estimated that the threshold of Grand Secretary Zhang's mansion had been trampled to pieces. There were at least 8 or 9 baskets of name tattoos that had been handed over. This was because regardless of whether it was the administrator or the judici, they could both be said to be real officials of the border. Just in terms of the territory under their jurisdiction, they were practically no different from the monarchs of a country during the spring and autumn period. Although the provincial governors of Hezhou and Jidushi were suppressed by the vassal king Zhao Yi and had no hope of becoming the judici, they could still fight for the administrator's throne. At this critical juncture, Su Fengnian had poked the hornet's nest. He didn't believe that the two provincial governors wouldn't admit defeat. Su Zhao's strength lay in that he couldn't make these two important ministers become the administrator, but he definitely had the ability to make them lose their positions. When Su Fengnian saw Blue Bird holding the Xana spear, he felt that something was off. He helplessly asked, "Are you tired?" Blue Bird shook her head very seriously. The 90 Phoenix Battalion Light Cavalry swiftly pursued and attacked. The horses' hooves shook the ground, and the crossbows shot out violently. As soon as someone fell off the horse, they would stoop down and stab him, or the crossbowman in the back would accurately shoot another arrow, nailing him to the ground. Fortunately, this was not an official road. Otherwise, the commoners would be scared out of their wits if they saw such a bloody scene. Once defeated, it would become a lifeless hunt. The Bailiang cavalry was originally selected from the Baimang cavalry who were good at fighting. Their horsemanship could compete with the nomadic cavalry of the grasslands of Baimang. Although the Bailiang army could not be said to have swept across the desert in recent years, the border cities and towns of the two countries were crisscrossed with each other. Every year, there would be small and medium-sized fierce battles. This was especially so under the purposeful arrangement of the Great Pillar State Su Shao and the tacit cooperation of the Baimang side. The scouts from both sides were habitually grouped into a group of 100 to 120 people to fight in pairs. Once they came into contact with each other, it would be a cruel battle of hunting and counter-hunting. The excellent horsemanship of the Bailiang cavalry was forcefully honed in this way. The soldiers of the Yan imperial and Guangling vassals were also considered ferocious soldiers in the past. Why was it that in the past decade or so, they were unable to compete with the Bailiang army and fight for the title of the world's greatest hero? It was because the Bailiang had the Baimang as a whetstone. The whetstone had the blood of both sides flowing on it. Before it dried, fresh blood would splash on it. The 20 riders were not able to withstand the slaughter. Soon, only the rider with the woman on his horse was left. Yuan Meng and the rider advanced side by side. The Bailiang knife in his hand was not in a hurry to be unsheathed. He grinned and said, "Brother, if you turn around and obediently go to our family's young master and offer this beauty to him, we will spare your life. If you continue to run, you will become a hedgehog." The rider from the Shenyuan family did not dare to believe it. He wished that his mount had 4 more legs and ran wildly, lashing the horsewhip to death. Yuan Meng laughed coldly and said, "Are you in a hurry to be reincarnated?" Chapter 283. With a flash of the blade, the head of the knight flew up. The headless corpse swayed and finally fell on the road. Yuan Meng leaped from the back of the horse and jumped onto the horse that had no one to drive it. He pulled the reins and the horse finally stopped. Yuan Meng laughed loudly and said, "Let's go back." Passing by the corpses of the enemy cavalry that were scattered on the road, Yuan Meng said viciously, "Give me another arrow. Remember to shoot the head. If any bastard dares to miss, get off the horse and pick up the arrow." The fearsome light cavalry roared with laughter. It turned out that one of them was trying to show off his skills on the white horse and tried to shoot the eyeball of a corpse. In the end, the eyeball brushed past his face and fell on the ground. Yuan Meng turned his head and scolded with a smile, "Wang Donglin, get off the horse and pick up the arrows one by one. If there is one arrow missing, I will make your ass bleed." The valiant light cavalry soldier called Wang Donglin scolded and got off the horse. He used his Bailiang saber to chop the corpse that caused him to lose face into a pile of mud. Then, he obediently went to the corpses one by one to pull out the arrows. He didn't forget to shout at the top of his lungs, "If anyone dares to talk to His Royal Highness about this, I will not let him off." Yuan Meng's laughter came from afar, "Young chick that hasn't even grown hair yet. How dare you talk about me? His Royal Highness said that when we reach Jianzhou, he will find 2 courtesans for each of us." Wang Donglin, who was pulling out the arrows from the corpses, wiped the saliva from the corner of his mouth. As a result, his face was covered in blood. Su Fengnian had nothing to do, so he personally drove the carriage that Murong Tonghuang was in. The 3 carriages slowly moved forward. The 3 coachmen were His Royal Highness, Spear Immortal Wang Xiu's daughter, and the old god of swords Li Chenggang. This group of horses was really terrifying. After meeting up with Yuan Meng, this general tried his best to gently hand Murong Wuzhu over to His Highness the Crown Prince. He scratched his head and grinned, "Killed all of them. No one was left alive." Murong Wuzhu had already fainted after seeing Yuan Tingshan's decapitation technique. It could be said that she was fortunate in her misfortune. Unfortunately, she was picked up by the Xianyuan family's cavalry and jolted violently. She woke up with a start. Her willowy waist was almost broken and she was in so much pain that her face was covered in cold sweat. After she was brought back to the carriage by the warm hands of an unfamiliar young master, she only knew that her future was uncertain. She was in a daze and did not dare to raise her head. Murong Tonghuang did not look at his sister. He lifted the curtain and looked at the broad back. He asked coldly, "Going to Sword Province?" Su Fengnian didn't turn around. He nodded and said, "Let's go to Mount Longhu and meet Jiangdong Xianyuan." Murong Tonghuang asked, "Who are you? You knew that these knights were puppets of the Xianyuan family, yet you still dared to kill them?" Su Fengnian smiled and said, "Me? My surname is Fu. My given name is Jun. Jun means gentleman." Murong Tonghuang sneered and let go of the curtain. Out of sight, out of mind. Murong Wuzhu hid in the carriage and endured the pain. She said timidly, "Thank you for saving my life, young master." Fortunately, Su Fengnian had sharp ears and heard it. He said with a smile, "According to the rules of Jianghu, young miss, you have to give yourself to me." Murong Wuzhu was stunned and her cheeks turned red. Murong Tonghuang saw this and frowned. His sister saw his expression and immediately kept quiet out of fear. Her face turned pale. Su Fengnian touched the sore spot and asked, "Why did the Xianyuan family catch you? You and your sister are unarmed. You don't have to become enemies with such an aristocratic family that can be ranked in the top 3 in Jianghu, right? Or is it that young Master Xianyuan covets your beauty?" Since the soft approach didn't work, he used the hard approach. Murong Tonghuang was silent. He pursed his lips tightly and looked cold and determined. It was a sharp contrast to his delicate and weak sister. Even with His Royal Highness's imagination, he still couldn't imagine that the ancestor of the Xianyuan family had taken a fancy to this pair of jade discs. Murong Wuzhu was old enough to be the old man's great-granddaughter. The old cow nibbled on the young grass to the extreme. Su Fengnian waved his hand and said to Yuan Meng, "Take 50 riders to the Hezhou provincial governor's office and tell him the situation here. If the old man is playing dumb with you, you can directly mention Chu Lushan. If not, damn it, I'll have to do it myself." Yuan Meng took the order and left. Murong Tonghuang's face finally became as pale as his sister's. He said with a trembling voice, "You're Chu Lushan's subordinate in Bailiang?" Su Fengnian was a little jealous of this damn fatty's reputation. He said angrily, "Don't worry, Chu Lushan won't touch you." Indeed, according to Lu Qiu's temperament, this fatty would even worship His Royal Highness's dog like his own father and mother. However, how could Murong Tonghuang, who didn't know the inside story, be at ease? Wouldn't it be equally miserable if he fell into the hands of Chu Lushan and that old freak Xuanyuan's hands? He handed the dagger to his sister and said coldly, "Without the dagger, I know you don't have the courage to bite your tongue and commit suicide. This is the last one. Hide it well." Murong Wuzhu took the dagger with trembling hands. She lowered her head and didn't dare to look at Murong Tonghuang. The convoy drove into Jichang City at the border of Hezhou. In fact, His Royal Highness had all the official plates, but whether he wanted to show them or not depended on his mood. Su Fengnian looked up at the top of the city wall. This city was unfortunately massacred by Su Shao during the Spring and Autumn War. Not 1 out of 10 families was left alive. It was only slightly better than Xiangfan. Su Fengnian drove indifferently into the city gate. Although there were only more than 30 light cavalry guards behind him, the gate guards didn't have the courage to be difficult to deal with. They could make things difficult for anyone, but they couldn't make things difficult for the soldiers. It would be strange if they didn't have a layer of skin ruthlessly peeled off when they encountered a military ruffian with a background. Su Fengnian had a deep impression of Jichang City. The tragic massacre was secondary. The most important thing was that there was a scholar here that Su Shao admired the most when he was young. His surname was Sun and his name was Ping. It was a very simple name that didn't even appear in any official history. There were no poems that were passed down, no romantic affairs or confessions. However, Su Fengnian knew that this young scholar, who argued with the old Grand Secretary until his lips turned blue, was the most farsighted scholar in Taiyan City. There, Su Shao, who returned to the capital for the first time, and Yang Taisui, who was not yet the state preceptor, met Sun Ping, a scholar from the Imperial College who was well versed in Confucianism and had extraordinary debating skills. Sun Ping wasn't even 20 years old yet, but he wrote a total of 21 books to the late emperor, such as Military Affairs, Selected Scholars, and Shu Shu. Unfortunately, all of them sank like stones into the sea. At that time, the emperor was only the most unremarkable prince. He visited the Imperial College 3 times and was regarded as a think tank. In the end, he was attacked by the Qing currents and retreated to his hometown, Jichang City. During the chaotic times of the spring and autumn period, Sun Ping took the blame for the current emperor and was cut in half at the waist in the downtown area of the city. At that time, it was still under the rule of West Chu. That year, he was only 24 years old. The 21 books from back then had already become the guiding principles of the country. Su Shao often repeated the words that this scholar, who didn't even have the strength to truss a chicken, had said to him: "Scholars can only add flowers to embroidery. Only martial artists can help the common people in their hour of need. The 9 kingdoms of the spring and autumn period are like a large chopping board. Su Shao, you can just treat yourself as a butcher. Don't do anything else. As long as you chop people up, 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 and chop people up, you'll be able to chop out a peaceful and prosperous era." Su Shao had done this and thus became the only prince with a different surname in the dynasty. Sun Ping didn't have the opportunity to add flowers to embroidery. Chapter 284. It's on the shelves. Tomorrow, I'll have a proper outburst. Every 10 monthly votes, I'll update it with 1,000 words. The maximum is 15,000 words. P.S. You're also casually smashing the recommendation tickets? After Su Fengnian entered the city, he chose a large inn. According to the dynasty's military regulations, the light cavalry behind him had to go to the government office to submit a military document. Then, Zhejiang City would arrange for a military camp to be stationed there. How could His Royal Highness take this seriously? When they alighted from the carriage, Murong Wuzhu and Murong Tonghuang had already put on thick curtained hats to cover their faces. When Murong Wuzhu saw Yu Yuwei holding Wu Meinyang, she was stunned. Clearly, she didn't expect that there would be such a beautiful woman in the cavalry. After that soul-stirring robbery and counter-robbery, her spirit was at rock bottom. She lowered her head and followed closely behind Su Fengnian. When she stepped onto the stairs, she suddenly bumped into His Royal Highness's back. She was overwhelmed with shock. She was afraid that she would offend this foreign general who was gentle in speech but ruthless in his methods. However, Su Fengnian only raised his head to size up the two large red lanterns hanging at the entrance of the inn. There was a couplet written on them: "Not too late, first cast 28, the rooster crows earlier, c. 33. In the past, he couldn't figure out the meaning of this couplet. When he asked old Huang and Wenhua, he was even more clueless. He beckoned Yu Wei over and asked her. Only then did he know that it was a missing character couplet. The Taoist had a saying that there were 28 constellations and 33 heavens. It was very humorous to use this couplet on lodging. It was enough to show how much the Taoist ancestral court, Mount Longhu, had infiltrated the secular world. When the innkeeper saw that the young master had brought along beautiful women and a large group of tiger wolf armored soldiers, he didn't dare to be negligent and personally went out to welcome them. He didn't care about the fact that it was difficult for him to bend his back. After seeing this handsome young master in luxurious clothes and jade belt, he couldn't straighten his back and eagerly recommended the inn's signature wine and meat. After receiving the room number, the hungry Su Fengnian asked the innkeeper to set up a table in the small courtyard. A middle-aged woman personally brought a pot of wine. When Su Fengnian wolfed down the food, he only caught a glimpse of her extremely slender waist. Therefore, her plump buttocks were especially shockingly curved. Moving his gaze up, he saw that her chest could also be considered spectacular. The innkeeper had a shifty-eyed appearance and wasn't very likable. However, this young woman, who was probably the innkeeper's wife, was plump and attractive. It seemed that the inn was determined to serve this group of foreign military lords well. When the young woman saw that the guests at the table had brought their own bowls and chopsticks, silver chopsticks inlaid with jade, emerald wine cups, and a servant girl in green clothes to test for poison, she was even more alarmed. Su Fengnian nibbled on a piece of pastry and raised his head to ask with a smile, "This pastry is not bad. What is it called?" The young woman carefully placed the pot of wine on the table and bent her waist to curtsy. Her plump chest bounced up and down as she spoke with a unique charming voice, reporting to the young master, "This is my inn's specialty lampcore cake." When Su Fengnian heard that pleasant accent, he exclaimed in surprise, "Madam is from Wuzhou?" This accent is authentic Wuhanghu dialect. It's very pleasant to the ears. Compared to the Piling Creek dialect, it's softer and more glutinous. The young woman covered her mouth with one hand and held her chest with the other. She smiled sweetly and said, "Young master has good hearing. Even some Wuzhou natives can't distinguish between Wuhanghu and Piling Creek accents." Su Fengnian waved his hand and smiled with squinted eyes. "If madam doesn't mind, please sit down and chat. I'm afraid that madam will be tired if she stands." The quick-witted young woman, who was looking around, saw that when the handsome young master said this, his eyes quietly swept across her chest. She secretly rejoiced in her heart and did not pretend to be shy. She openly sat down. She knew that she was no longer in her prime. If she pretended to be a young girl, it would only annoy people. She might as well be straightforward and rely on her mature and plump body to tease men. However, after entering the courtyard, she did not dare to look carefully. She only focused on the handsome man in front of her. After sitting down and looking around, she suddenly felt ashamed of her inferiority. The woman with the white cat in her arms was really beautiful. Although she could not see the faces of the three women with curtains covering their faces, her refined temperament made her feel as if she was sitting on pins and needles. She wanted to cry but had no tears. This time, she had lost a lot of face. Fortunately, the young master did not dislike her and talked to her about the local customs of Wuzhou. This made her originally dead heart reignite. She thought to herself, could it be that this handsome young man is tired of eating bird's nest and shark's fin and wants to try this unpresentable but tasteful lampwick cake? Su Fengnian suddenly asked, "Who has Xianyuan taken a fancy to recently?" The young woman subconsciously said, "Young master, are you talking about the brother and sister of the Murong family? I heard that recently they will be brought to Mount Hui. The young scholars in Jianzhou who are in love with them are stomping their feet and cursing them." Su Fengnian gently smiled and said, which Xianyuan young master is so lucky? The elder sister is called Murong Wuzhu and the younger brother is called Murong Tonghuang. They are the most famous pair of beauties in the neighboring Jianzhou. There is even a ballad to praise them. It is said that they will be able to go to the imperial palace in the capital in the future. Isn't there a Wudong palace in the capital? When the siblings were born, an immortal elder revealed the will of heaven and left a ballad as a prophecy. The general meaning is that the male and female will enter the Wudong palace together. The young woman saw the gentle smile on the young master's face and drank a mouthful of wine. She became bolder and whispered, I also heard that the Xianyuan family is afraid that the siblings are too famous and will spread to the imperial palace. Isn't there a rouge review in the Jianghu? In order to prevent the Murong family from being listed on the review board, the Xianyuan family's ancestor put in a lot of effort. Su Fengnian narrowed his phoenix eyes. The purple-red mark between his eyebrows was like a vertical eyebrow. He became more and more elegant. He said softly and playfully, then isn't the taste of the Xianyuan family's ancestor a bit too heterogeneous? He won't even let Murong Tonghuang go? The young woman was already stunned. She only came back to her senses when the maidservant in green coughed. She lowered her head to drink wine to cover up her embarrassment. She raised her head to look at the young master and smiled charmingly. I heard that Murong Tonghuang is more beautiful than a woman. Chapter 285. Princess Jing and sat at the table while the Murong siblings stood behind Su Fengnian. Their expressions were different. Murong Wuzhu was sad, worried, and helpless. She just stared at the back of Xianyuan and felt that she had luckily grasped onto a life-saving straw. No matter how big of a storm Xianyuan would cause or whether this straw would be broken by the deep-rooted Xianyuan family, she was not a tenacious woman. If it wasn't for her brother's insistence, even if she was taken to Mount Hui to be Xuanyuan's plaything, she would only cry a few times and accept her fate. Murong Tonghuang was furious. He pursed his lips and didn't say a word. Su Fengnian laughed and said, Madam, tell me how handsome Murong Tonghuang is. I don't believe that a man can be that handsome. Murong Tonghuang snorted coldly behind him. If the last dagger wasn't given to Murong Wuzhu, he would have stabbed him in the back. The proprietress had a strange look in her eyes and goosebumps. She mistakenly thought that the young master in front of her had a scholarly hobby. Su Fengnian's face was full of grievances, causing the lady boss's heart to ache so much that she wished she could pull him into her embrace and show him some tender affection. Immediately, her expression returned to normal, her elegant eyebrows raised, and in an instant, she displayed the flirtatious charm of a young married woman. A woman's charm, indeed, the young had their good points, and the mature had their good points. She charmingly said, This servant has also not truly seen him. I only heard that his appearance can cause the lotus to not bloom. Su Fengnian nodded and said with emotion, Xianyuan is indeed worthy of the name of a womanizer. No matter how ignorant the young woman was, she still knew that Xuanyuan's family background was splendid. She nervously reminded him, Young master, you should be careful with your words. Although this is not Jianzhou, it's better to be safe than sorry. Su Fengnian smiled and nodded, I appreciate your kindness, but I can't repay you. I can only ask for more wine and snacks. The proprietress was very tactful. She enchantingly stood up and curtsied again. Her chest immediately trembled as she turned and walked out of the courtyard. Su Fengnian waited until she left the courtyard before he let the three beauties take off their restraints and sit down to eat. When the Murong siblings saw Princess Jing'an's appearance, they were stunned. Obviously, they didn't expect that there was such a cool beauty in this world. Murong Wuzhu's eyes dimmed. Murong Tonghuang quietly sighed in relief. His hostility towards the unfathomable general's son dissipated a little. Su Fengnian looked at the three people eating slowly. He asked Blue Bird to fetch a Bailiang short crossbow from the Phoenix Battalion. In the world's military, custom-made was a very sensitive key. From the Bailiang army to the small bows, crossbows, and sabers, all of the regulations were clear and organized. Not to mention the Bailiang sabers, the crossbow in His Royal Highness' hands was also very particular. The crossbow was a crossbow with a horizontal posture. It was different from the bow, which could be shot immediately. The advantage of a crossbow was that the string could be drawn and the shot could be separated. The Bailiang crossbow had the ability to shoot continuously. This crossbow could shoot 4 pearls consecutively. Su Fengnian lowered his head. His fingers stroked the short crossbow's hanging blade and the hook with a concentrated expression. Murong Tong Wang asked seemingly unintentionally, "Crossbow?" Su Fengnian did not pay him any attention. He just remembered the Bailiang army's famous flowing crossbows. The crossbowmen rode their horses and roamed the battlefield, shuttling back and forth, sniping the enemy's generals and taking their lives from a distance of 100 paces. They were one of the Bailiang's renowned elite troops. It was not easy to become a flowing crossbowman. One's horsemanship and archery had to be outstanding. They were ranked first among the 6 classes of soldiers in Bailiang. There were more than 1,200 of them in total. Among them, 600 were organized into the Big Hut Battalion, and the rest were mostly scouts and roaming sentries. There was an unwritten rule in Bailiang: if a Baimang's son wanted to go to the border to earn real military merit, he must first be trained by the old soldiers to lose a few layers of skin and a few pounds of meat. If he was qualified and outstanding, he would be thrown into the sentry battalion as a scout. Only after fighting with the Bailiang spies with real swords and spears and cutting off 3 heads would he be considered to have a foothold in the Bailiang army. Not long ago, Li Hanlin sent a letter saying that he had successfully become a roaming sentinel. He had dreamed of running into those barbarians in Baimang. In the letter, he said that when his father heard that he was not content to stay in the rear and instead went to work as a scout, he was so angry that smoke was coming out of his 7 orifices. He did not have time to attend to the government affairs and rushed to the border military town, wanting to kidnap the only son of the Li family who was going to carry on the Li family's ancestral line and bring him home. He almost had a conflict with the Bailiang army. Fortunately, De Zhuguo rushed back to the border from the capital and persuaded Li Hanlin, who was about to take the post of Bailiang's Taoist strategist, to go back. It was the Baimang that had been waging war all year round in the Liang dynasty. Su Fengnian was in a daze. The frontier poets of the dynasty liked to view the barbarians as animals that drank raw meat and drank blood. In the 100 barbarian country, the people were valiant. The barbarian soldiers were all armored cavalry, and there were hundreds of thousands of soldiers who controlled the strings. From the emperor to the common people, there was a custom of widowing after the death of the father, the wife after the death of the mother, the wife after the death of the elder brother. In the eyes of the dynasty, this was simply shocking and had no morals to speak of. However, the biggest scandal of Baimang in recent years was that a woman who had caused chaos in the palace had become the emperor. In 30 years, she had served 3 emperors, of which 2 were father and son. The last emperor, who had only ascended the throne for 13 days, could even be considered her nephew. This was something that was absolutely unimaginable in the Liang dynasty. It was said that this empress had 3,000 male companions. She was over 50 years old, but she was still very lustful. A few years ago, she had even sent a secret envoy to send a message to Su Shao. As long as Su Shao was willing to surrender to Baimang, she was willing to be his wife and share the world with him. Su Shao was also straightforward with this huge meat pie that could sow discord and win him over. He first killed the envoy and then sent a message to Baimang. It was just 5 words: "Slave Su still thinks I'm too old." Su Fengnian smiled. Su Shao was too vicious. That old woman was the empress of Baimang, but he still thought she was too old to be his servant. However, that old woman's scheming was really terrifying. She was not angry at this monstrous humiliation. She just laughed it off. Su Fengnian put down his crossbow and looked up to see the unhappy Murong Tongwang. He frowned and said, "Don't put on airs in front of me. Even a stray cat or dog on the roadside knows how to wag its tail." Murong Tonghuang's eyes were cold as he stared at Su Fengnian. Su Fengnian stretched out his hand and flicked the embroidered winter scabbard. The embroidered winter rose up and with a bang, the most famous beautiful youth in Jianzhou staggered back and fell to the ground. Su Fengnian sneered and said, "I'm not that pervert Xianyuan Pan. I'm not interested in you. So what if you look like a woman? Can you give birth to a son for me?" A mule born from a donkey and a mare. Do you know that? You're one. Murong Wuzhu was stunned by Su Fengnian's vicious words. Murong Tonghuang lowered his head and squeezed out a laugh from the gap between his teeth. It was unknown where Murong Wuzhu's courage came from. He held a dagger with both hands and faced Su Fengnian. Su Fengnian picked up the crossbow again and pressed it against Murong Tonghuang's head. Murong Wuzhu, whose face was full of tears, cried out in alarm, "No!" Murong Tonghuang raised his head. The crossbow was pressed against his forehead. He looked up at Su Fengnian and unexpectedly smiled. His smile could bring disaster to a country and its people. It was especially natural and charming. He said softly, "I know I'm wrong." Murong Wuzhu's dagger fell to the ground. He stared at Murong Tonghuang in a daze as if he was staring at a stranger. Princess Jing and smiled strangely. Yu Yuwei did not look at this scene. She stroked Wu Meinyang's soft hair. Su Fengnian squatted down and looked at that face. He said calmly, "So pitiful." Chapter 286. Chapter 1, 4,000 words. Yang Qingfeng participated in the hunt for Yuan Tingshan. He had learned a wide variety of skills and was proficient in unorthodox methods. He was good at controlling animals. Xu Xiu, who was born as a witch in Nanjiang, was not bad either. She had many secret techniques. She kept a distance of 100 steps from Yang Qingfeng and advanced side by side. Ningame threw away the bow, iron halberd. With the halberd pouch on her back and 2 flying halberds in her hands, she led more than a dozen light cavalry to abandon their horses and enter the forest. Assuming a fan-shaped formation, she held short crossbows and charged forward. Jitami priest Wei Shuyang's body was like a mountain elf, leaping from branch to branch, coordinating with Ningame. The 3 tracking forces cast an inescapable net in pursuit of the young swordsman. After Yang Qingfeng entered the forest, he bent down from time to check for clues on the ground. At first, he could still see footprints in the forest, deep and shallow. It was easy to chase, but soon the footprints began to fade. His footsteps suddenly widened. The escape route was no longer as simple as simply stepping on the ground. Instead, it was placed on tree trunks or rocks. Yang Qingfeng stopped and squatted down. He stretched out 2 sickly snow-white fingers to pinch some soil and sniffed it. His other hand took out 3 red-clawed black rats from a small pouch tied around his waist. He sprinkled the soil on the tips of their noses, and the little fellows scurried into the depths of the forest. Xu Xian came to Yang Qingfeng's side at some point and said lightly, "I didn't expect this kid to have some skills. I think we should just split up and completely widen the distance between us. Otherwise, if we accidentally hang ourselves on a tree, we won't have the face to see His Highness." The gloomy Yang Qingfeng nodded. He didn't want to work with this woman. It would be best if he could do it alone. He could also use some of his hidden tricks. Xu Xiu didn't dare to neglect His Royal Highness's important task. She waved her sleeves and changed direction. Like a goshawk, she soared into the sky. She stepped on the branches like a dragonfly skimming the surface of the water. After several bounces, she stood at the top of the tree. However, she didn't open her eyes to look into the distance. Instead, she closed her eyes and wrinkled her small nose. She suddenly opened her eyes and the corners of her mouth curled. Her delicate body swooped down quickly. She changed direction in the forest and chased after a breath. The swordsman was very cunning. He had already carefully and deliberately concealed his footprints. However, Xu Xiu was still able to follow him by relying on the breath that was against the wind. She muttered seductively, "Little guy is really naughty. Sister is so tired that I'm sweating all over. If I catch you, I'll skin you alive and pull out your tendons." In less than an hour, Xu Xiu successfully saw the swordsman's back twice. One time, the swordsman didn't run away. Instead, he ambushed Xu Xiu. His whole robust body was like a gecko sticking to the trunk of a tree. If Xu Xiu hadn't sensed that the breath had become heavier and determined that the swordsman was nearby, she would have been cut in half by the swordsman's saber. After Shu Xiu nimbly dodged this fierce and murderous strike, she retreated. Her hands and feet were glued to the trunk of a nearby tree. She looked down at the young swordsman who was grinning maliciously. She gently patted her heavy chest with one hand and said with a charming smile, "Oh, little brother, you don't even know how to have tender feelings for the fairer sex. Sister was worried about you all the way here for nothing." Yuan Tingshan, who was being chased by this woman like a shadow, wasn't flustered at all. He sheathed his saber and said with a mischievous smile, "My little brother isn't small. If sister doesn't believe me, when it's just the two of us later, Yuan Tingshan will definitely make sister ecstatic." Shu Xiu, who was glued to the tree like a spider, said with a charming look, "Your little mouth is really sweet." Yuan Tingshan's ears kept trembling slightly. He tapped his legs with his saber. The two heavy lead weights wrapped around his calves shattered and fell to the ground. He said with a smile, "Sister's lover will be here soon. Little brother doesn't have the hobby of fighting 2 dragons and 1 phoenix. I'll leave first." If sister's mother was still here, she could have called sister to roll in bed with little brother. Sister is so beautiful, presumably mother's charm is still there. With 2 peaks confronting each other, little brother will be captured without a fight. Unfortunately, only sister is here today. Forgive me for not accompanying you. While he was flirting, Yuan Tingshan, who had lost more than 10 jin of weight on his legs, retreated with unusual agility. In a flash, he disappeared without a trace. Shu Xiu, who wasn't in a hurry to chase, slowly landed on the ground. She stuck out her small lilac tongue and licked the corner of her mouth. She clicked her tongue and laughed, teasing this old lady. After this close combat, the quick-witted Yuan Tingshan began to flee with the wind. He no longer went against the wind and left clues for Shu Xiu. This made Shu Xiu's anger soar. After she reunited with Yang Qingfeng by the stream, she saw Yang Qingfeng squatting on the ground to pick up a heavy iron inner jacket. Nearby, a black rat was nailed to the ground by a branch. Shu Xiu's mood improved. She looked across the stream and sniffed. She frowned and said, "This boy's martial arts are still okay, but he's as cunning as a fox. It's not a good idea to continue chasing him. Practicing lightness kung fu is clearly the stupid path of carrying a monolith. I estimate that he's carrying at least 20 jin of weight. You and I are not afraid of competing with just the strength of our legs. But he's going to attack faster and faster. The one surnamed Yang, don't fail miserably at such an easy task. Lu Qiantang is dead. Don't fall here. Sister is very lonely." Yang Qingfeng snorted coldly. Stepping on a rock, she prepared to leap across the stream. Although Shu Xiu seemed to be chatting idly, she had been sniffing Yuan Tingshan's scent all along. It drifted over from a distance. In addition, there were footprints on the ground by the stream. Logically speaking, they should have crossed the stream and entered the forest. But as Shu Xiu sniffed, her expression changed dramatically. "Be careful." Her voice had barely faded when the water in the middle of the stream splashed up violently. He had accurately calculated the flow of Yang Qingfeng's qi. At the critical moment when Yang Qingfeng's body was slanting downwards, this ruthless saber stabbed out at the perfect moment. Fortunately, Yang Qingfeng's legs kicked against the cloud and rose up, forcibly raising her body by 10 feet. But if she stopped there, Yuan Tingshan's determined saber strike could still seriously injure Yang Qingfeng's legs. Shu Xiu's mind was instantly filled with hundreds of thoughts. Gritting her teeth, she kicked out a pebble with the tip of her foot, which violently shot toward Yuan Tingshan's Taiyang acupoint. In this rapidly changing situation, the outsider Shu Xiu held the initiative. If she did not interfere, Yang Qingfeng would most likely be at a disadvantage. Shu Xiu's kick could be divided into 2 subtle situations. If the pebble hit the blade, it would be most beneficial for Yang Qingfeng to get out of this predicament. But this pebble was aimed directly at Yuan Tingshan's Achilles heel. Shu Xiu's plan of sitting on top of the mountain and watching the tigers fight could be said to be ingenious. Without the slightest hesitation, Yuan Tingshan withdrew his saber and blocked the pebble. His body sank into the stream, and then he exploded the stream water and swept to the opposite bank. Laughing loudly, he said, "Sister, you have a new lover, but you still don't forget your old one. You're so greedy. Be careful not to overfill your stomach." Expressionless, Yang Qingfeng's toes tapped on the surface of the water. Like a swallow, she swept to the opposite bank. She said flatly, "I owe you one." Xu Xiu narrowed her eyes and did not say anything. Chapter 287. Chapter 2. With a calm and collected face, Su Fengnian left the city together with the old god of swords to visit the tombs. The accompanying green bird brought along Zhichang City's most famous Angelica wine. Li Chungang mocked, "How can such a soft-hearted person accomplish such a dog-fart important matter? There are so many pitiful people under the heavens. Do you have 3 heads and 6 arms or what? Can you take care of them all?" Su Fengnian rolled his eyes and said, "I already don't like the Xianyuan family, which is one of the top 3 families in the martial world. Now that I finally have something to use against them, if I don't go to the bull gang and cause a ruckus, I'll be sorry for being chased out by Xianyuan Qingfeng. Doesn't the Xianyuan family see siblings as food on the plate? Heh, I'll make the meat in my mouth fall into my own plate." If he's not convinced, he can make a move. When the time comes, it's no big deal for the old senior to open the gates of heaven again. The old god of swords glanced at him and said, "Can you stop scheming against this old man all the time? Now that you don't have Jiang and I to support you, if you really annoy this old man, he'll open the gates of heaven with his sword." Su Fengnian changed the topic and asked, "What kind of person is that old Xianyuan guy? I heard that if this pervert doesn't have a woman for a day, his eyes will turn red, his cheeks will become red like fire, and his skin will crack and his tendons will twitch. It sounds like he's possessed by the devil." The old man with the sheepskin fur coat thought for a moment and said with a crooked mouth, "What else can he be like?" Su Fengnian said helplessly, "Tell me in detail. We're about to go to Mount Hui to cause trouble, so we have to know ourselves and the enemy. If we go down the mountain with great fanfare and end up rolling down the mountain with our tails between our legs, that woman Xianyuan Qingfeng will laugh her head off." Li Chungang had an impatient expression and said lightly, "This old man can probably be considered half a martial genius, but he can't compare to Wang Xianji." Su Fengnian whispered, "Nonsense, if he's the same as Wang Xianji, why would I go to the bull gang?" The old god of swords kicked his royal highnesses butt and turned around to ask Blue Bird for Angelica wine to quench his thirst. In the end, he was met with a cold look. He sighed and said, "Brat, you only care about showing off in front of the siblings, you don't know the immensity of heaven and earth. If. Goo. And." It sounded like he had been lustful and disrespectful all these years, but it was not that simple. This fellow had been proficient in Buddhism since a long time ago. In addition, his inner strength was already profound when he was in the prime of his life. He used the Yin cauldron to supplement the Yang cauldron to adjust the heart obstacle. Once he succeeded, he would have achieved immortality and his cultivation would be comparable to the great Jinren of Taoism. It's up to you whether you want to go to Mount Huishan. Su Fengnian rubbed his chin and thought about it seriously. The old god of swords asked softly, "Which one do you like between the siblings?" Su Fengnian's mouth twitched, "Old senior, you're wrong." The old god of swords said, "Indeed, with that guy who borrowed your spring thunder embroidered winter double blades, I'm afraid Murong Tonghuang won't catch your eye." "Then when do you make a move on that white fox face?" "The later it is, the more you can't beat him. You won't even have the chance to force yourself on him. Actually, this old man can teach you a simple method. You just have to think of yourself as a woman. That white fox face is a man. Anyway, he's the most beautiful woman in the world. You won't lose out." Su Fengnian felt his hair stand on end and goosebumps appeared all over his body. He was full of grief and indignation. Li Chungang said disdainfully, "What? You want to fight with this old man?" Su Fengnian immediately flattered, "How can I? I'm still waiting for old senior's sword to go against the flow of the 6-layered waterfall and flood that bull mound." Li Chungang said disdainfully, "Virtue." After leaving Zhejiang City, they walked for 2 hours before they finally found a lonely grave. Weeds grew crazily in the 3-foot-long grave. Su Fengnian squatted down and pulled out the weeds that wrapped around the tombstone. He looked at the tombstone that was less than 3 feet tall and remained silent. After more than 20 years of cold wind and rain, the writing was already mottled and unclear. He could only vaguely see the fragmented sentences. The sun rises from the East Sea, the earth's chi surges boundlessly, the sun sets in Kunlun, the vault of heaven returns to rest, spring and autumn return to spring and autumn, the sound of horses' hooves breaking the sound of reading books, I will encompass the universe, the vastness is the same as Qingming. The old god of swords had nothing to do, so he squatted down and squinted at the broken text on the tombstone, clicking his tongue in wonder. Su Fengnian took the wine from Blue Bird and slowly sprinkled it in front of the grave. The grave was at the top of the mountain. After offering a pot of wine, Su Fengnian sat on the ground and looked at the fields in the distance. He muttered to himself, I've always been good at writing, so I can only spend money to buy some poems from the scholars of Bailiang. Second sister was right, most of the poems I bought were just to express my worries. When read out loud, it's like a resentful woman crying for love. It's unbearable to the ear. But why can't the one in the grave live a few more years and write a few more sentences, 50 years of great work, told to the mountain ghosts? The old god of swords sat cross-legged and took off his boots. He picked his toes with his fingers and brought them to his nose for a sniff. He chuckled and said, if he's dead, he's dead. The one in the grave is not bad. There are still people coming to visit his grave. Like this old man, who would bring wine to the grave after his death and sweep the grave and pull out weeds. Su Fengnian nodded and said, that's true. The old man rubbed the soles of his feet and turned his head to ask, young Su, do you think you're pitiful? Su Fengnian laughed involuntarily and said, me? I'm the Motherf * king heir of Bailiang. Didn't someone from the previous dynasty say that I'll be the food of a cauldron when I'm alive and be cooked in a cauldron when I'm dead? I was born with mountains of gold and silver and didn't have to worry about food and clothing. There aren't many people in the world who care about food and clothing more than I do. Now that I even have hereditary inheritance, I still * king feel pitiful. I'd rather hang myself with my hair or suffocate myself to death with a woman's breasts. That's why I only feel pity for the descendants of a fallen country and the Jianghu assassins who went to Bailiang Palace to seek death. I don't think they're hateful. Since I'm Su Zhao's son, should have this awareness. There's no such thing as enjoying life without suffering the cold or hunger. I still had some resentment before I left with old Huang, but it's gone now. The old god of swords laughed and said, you're quite open-minded. Su Fengnian said self-deprecatingly, actually, I'm also worried. Li Chungang smiled and asked, what are you worried about? Su Fengnian pulled up a weed and flicked the dirt off its roots. He put it in his mouth and chewed carefully. He said, I'm just worried about not being able to learn the two-sleeved green snake. The old god of swords said heroically, this old man's supreme art isn't something that can be learned so easily. Su Fengnian said softly, actually, I know that Senior's 216 green snakes are like forging iron, making the big yellow cord in my body more stable. As for how much of the two-sleeved green snake's essence I can learn, it's all up to fate, right? Li Chungang narrowed his eyes and said slowly, you're indeed not stupid. To put it bluntly, the two-sleeved green snake's sword moves are already extremely complicated, almost untraceable. Even if you wanted to learn it, you wouldn't know where to start. As for the sword opening the gate of heaven, it's purely sword intent, so you won't be able to learn it. Su Fengnian sighed bitterly while Blue Bird smiled behind him. The old god of swords also picked up a weed and chewed it. He spat it out and said, next, this old man will have to trouble you a little to feed you moves. Kid, don't bite off more than you can chew. First, you'll have to work on those 20 moves that you've pieced together. Actually, this old man's punches and kicks are enough to deal with Wang Mingyin. Without waiting for Su Fengnian to speak, the old god of swords wiped his face and said, if little Jiang was here, she would definitely say that this old man doesn't even have a draft for bragging. Su Fengnian chuckled. He thought about which corner Miss Hehe was hiding in, waiting to make a move. The three of them went down the mountain and walked on the path in the field. Kid Su, You really don't have any thoughts about that beauty called Murong Tongwang? This kind of twin lotus flower on one stalk is hard to distinguish between male and female. It can be called an immortal item. Even with this old man's outstanding eyesight, it's a once-in-a-century chance. Are you really not tempted? You can be tempted. This old man can turn a blind eye to your beastly behavior this time. Just think that Murong Tonghuang is a woman. When the lights are dark at night, can you tell who is Murong Wuzhu and who is Murong Tonghuang? Can you tell who is male and who is female? Kid, why don't you fart? Old senior, I can't beat you in a fight now. What? Little brat, don't think that this old man will feed you moves. In the future, I'll still use the two-sleeved green snake to take care of you. Don't. Then, do you want to eat this pair of twin lotus flowers on one stalk? Get lost. Kid, you've been holding it in for more than a year, haven't you? Get lost. How can the word miserable be enough to describe it? There are so many peerless beauties in front of you, but you can't even eat a single one of them. Miserable, miserable. Old senior, can I get lost? Blue Bird walked behind. Listening to His Royal Highness and the old god of swords bickering, she smiled like a lotus flower in clear water. Chapter 288. Chapter 3. In the mountain forest, danger lurked everywhere. Xu Xiu, Yang Qingfeng, Ningame, and Wei Shuyang's groups gathered together. They all felt a sense of powerlessness and frustration. Several times, they wanted to surround and capture him, but in the end, that brat found an opportunity to escape. He was as slippery as a loach. One time, Ningame's short halberd even pierced that person's arm. That brat forcibly withstood a blow from old Taoist Mi's sleeve and used the momentum to roll a few times. Full of viciousness, he left behind a sentence, "Grandson, this grandfather will definitely return the favor double in the future." His shoulder knocked aside a Phoenix Battalion light cavalry behind him, and he once again fled into the shadows of the forest. The light cavalry was heavily injured by that ferocious collision. Yang Qingfeng's 3 red-clawed rats were all dead, and the last 2 had been crushed to death by that brat. Xu Xiu's expression was extremely unsightly. The best opportunity had been when that brat with a mouth full of obscenities had been shot by a powerful crossbow and forced into a dead end. However, with Xu Xiu's 2 hands and the vigorous internal energy that could activate the red armor of the Talisman General, she was only able to slap that brat surnamed Yuan into a tree. The thick tree had already been snapped, but he was still alive. This definitely wasn't Xu Xiu's intention to slowly play with him like a cat catching a rat. With one hand, she should have slapped that brat until his insides split open. Xu Xiu couldn't figure out the strangeness of this situation. If it was a simple superposition of martial strength, this side was definitely much stronger than that brat. However, Yuan Tingshan's bladesmanship was firm and unyielding, and his temperament was rather cautious. In addition, he seemed to have a keen sense of danger. Twice, when the net was just a hair away from closing, he was able to escape. Ningame cupped some water from the stream and patted his face. He calmly said, "This person is a natural scout." Xu Xiu was slightly angered. "General Ning, if we can't capture this person, then we shouldn't leave the mountain." The paralyzed Yang Qingfeng expressionlessly said, "With His Royal Highness Gerfalcon's helping to keep an eye on him, we can capture him." Xu Xiu's anger flared even more. She mocked, "You're really promising." Wei Shuyang acted as the peacemaker. "No rush, no rush. The Phoenix Battalion is familiar with traveling at night. We'll chase for one more night. If we still can't find him tomorrow morning, we'll immediately leave the mountain and head to Zhejiang City. At that time, if your highness is angry, this humble Taoist will bear it." His expression, he turned his head, and asked, without a change of expression. He turned his head, and asked. Because they were busy chasing after the enemy, they didn't have time to retrieve many of the arrows that were shot out. Other than the one who was heavily injured, the other 9 members of the Phoenix Battalion reported the number of arrows they had shot out. Ningame said, "Let's redistribute it." Zhu Ji, Yizhenfu, you two escort the injured Xiao Donglu. Purposely keep a distance from us and act as bait. Without any hesitation, the two white horses replied, understood. Wei Shuyang couldn't bear it. He said softly, General Ning, isn't this a little? Ningame, whose voice was as soft as that of the young woman from Wuzhou in Jigang City, smiled. She did not explain anything, but Xu Xiong could see the determination in this general's eyes. Xu Xiu couldn't help but ask, General Ning, are you sure that kid will fall into the trap? Ningame said calmly, Yuan Tingshan has a vengeful personality. He's also very opportunistic. Even if there's a risk, he's willing to take a gamble. In this encirclement, I can see that this person has always believed in his gamble. Xu Xiu said, oh. She didn't say anything else. As long as the mission was completed, the death of a few light cavalry was nothing to her. But in her heart, her evaluation of this good-tempered Bailiang general increased. An hour later, Yuan Tingshan squatted on a branch and stared at the 3 light cavalry that had left the formation. The wound on his arm had been bandaged, and the short halberd was in his mouth. To kill or not to kill? Yuan Tingshan was hesitating. He could kill people with a sharp blade, but he could also cut flesh with a blunt blade. Even with his strong will, he was cursing in his heart. An originally easy mission had turned into such a miserable state. Even a clay bodhisattva would have some anger. Yuan Tingshan believed that in terms of talent, he was not inferior to the disciples of the aristocratic families. Among the Xianyuan brothers on the Bull Mound, 2 of them had left the mountain to travel the Jianghu to earn their reputation as heroes. One of them had almost had the tendons in his arms and legs broken, while the other had some real skills. They fought to a draw, but Yuan Tingshan only lost in terms of moves. If he really fought with his life on the line, he was confident that he could cripple the elegant aristocratic family disciple within 100 moves. A cold smile appeared on Yuan Tingshan's face. Reincarnation was very important. If one was born into a good mother's womb, they would be able to easily obtain top-tier secret manuals. With the guidance of an expert in the family, they would be stable. The people of the same age from the aristocratic families would pretend to be extraordinary. If they could not beat them, they could just cry to their parents. It would be difficult to suffer even if they wanted to. Song Kelly was undoubtedly one of the best among these people. Yuan Tingshan lowered his head and looked at the padao that was as inconspicuous as his own. What could he rely on? He could only rely on this damn padao to carve out a future for himself. Hateful. Hateful, I should kill. Kill. I don't believe that I will die here. As long as I don't live long enough, even the king of hell will not be able to take my life. Yuan Tingshan bit the short halberd and was about to jump down from the branch. His body instantly stiffened, like a full moon bow. Someone above him laughed. At this critical moment, Yuan Tingshan was about to fight to the death. That person said softly, don't regret it. Yuan Tingshan did not move at all. He did not hesitate to reverse the flow of his qi. Blood oozed out from the corner of his mouth due to his internal injuries. However, his mind was extremely clear. No one wants to buy your life. I am too lazy to kill you. I just find it fun to see you running around. I don't want you to die so early. Yuan Tingshan gritted his teeth and asked, who are you? There was no response. Yuan Tingshan risked looking up and saw a little girl squatting on a swaying branch. She was carrying a golden sunflower. On the tree and under the tree, they stared at each other. Other than an old man who taught me how to kill, I usually only talk to the dead or those who are about to die. If you speak more than 20 words, you will die even if you don't. How many words have you seen? The girl spoke very stiffly. At the end of her sentence, the corners of her mouth curled up. Yuan Tingshan's qi surged. He was not only bleeding from the corner of his mouth, but also from his 7 orifices. However, at this moment, his blade emitted an inch-long bluish-purple glow. That day, he went deep into Mount Longhu with Xianyuan Qingfeng and saw a middle-aged Taoist fishing. He was the only one who ate all the vermilion fruits. At first, Yuan Tingshan did not think much of it. However, when he went down the mountain and boarded the boat, he heard a voice. It was that Taoist's voice. He only said the words "dragon spits water." However, when he looked around, he could not see that Taoist. Then, his chi began to roll. When he arrived at Mount Hui, he vomited blood all the way up the mountain. When he arrived at Sixfold Waterfall, he almost crawled under the dragon spits water. Later, he had to carry the torrential water on his back. With his physique, it was reasonable to say that he could hold on for half an hour. Any longer and he would hurt his internal organs and meridians. However, he sat there for 24 hours. It was indescribably mysterious. His realm advanced rapidly. This was the biggest reason why Yuan Tingshan dared to use his blade against that young master on the white horse. Now, he only lacked a secret blade technique manual. Yuan Tingshan raised his blade and chopped off half of the branches of the towering tree. At some point, the little girl was squatting on a nearby tree. She was still carrying that eyesore of a sunflower. She said calmly, your realm advanced." This time, Yuan Tingshan was really running for his life. Chapter 289. The original name of Yinshi Pass had long been forgotten. It became Yinshi Pass only because a poet from the frontier fortress of the previous dynasty said that the southern geese wept to the north. This pass was heavily guarded by Bailiang. With one man guarding the pass, it forcibly blocked the northern barbarians' passage to the south. Dark clouds covered the city, wind and rain filled the buildings, and sand and rolling stones were flying in the desert. However, in the distance, one could vaguely see Bailiang's soldiers continuing to train in the sandstorm. Bailiang was as cold and bitter as the Bailiang cavalry. Further north, although there were more deserts, there were also patches of fertile water plants. The area around Yinshi Pass was completely desolate and barren. A white-clothed man stood at the top of the city wall. On his left was Dian Xiongzong, who looked like a western lion. On his right was Wei Fucheng, who looked like a poor old pedant. Dian Xiongzong, who held 6,000 iron stupa heavy cavalry, opened his bloody mouth and stood at the top of the city wall for a long time. In the end, he couldn't help but roar, "General, now that Bailiang Road has been established, it's natural for the great general to be the Jidushi. Whoever dares to snatch this position, old Dian will chop him down with an axe." But why should the governor of Feng province, Li Gongda, be the administrator? This old fellow claims to be the second best at making money, and no one says he's the first. How can he govern Bailiang? Bah, I'll spit on his face. Old Dian, I'll say the ugly words here. If Li Gongda has the guts to be the administrator, we'll take 6,000 cavalry and slaughter him. Wei Fucheng's body was weak. As the wind and sand blew, he coughed repeatedly. He raised his sleeve to cover his mouth and said vaguely, "Don't talk nonsense. The administrator is not a rare thing. It doesn't matter who sits in this position. As for the supervisor, I don't know which guy the imperial court will send to take this position." Dian Xiongzong said carelessly, "Wei Fuzi, you're King poor and fastidious. How is the administrator not a good thing? Shouldn't the second most important official in Bailiang be our general?" Wei Fucheng waved his sleeve and said with a helpless smile, "You're a guy who only has strength but not brains. If the administrator is the general, then it will be a big problem. If the imperial court wants to do this, and the general doesn't refuse." Teacher Wei stopped speaking halfway. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the rolling black clouds in the sky. He sighed softly. Stunned, Dian Xiongnu said, "What do you mean?" "Wei Fuzi, it's not like you don't know that old Dian's head was kicked by a horse when he was a child. It's useless. Whenever I move my head hurts." This was absolutely true. The third-rank military officer, Dian Xiongzong, had incomparable strength at a young age. One time, he was dragging a horse in reverse on the street. In the end, he was turned around and trampled by the crazy horse. Not to mention his body, his head was ruthlessly trampled by the horse's hooves. It was a miracle that he didn't die. However, everyone in Bailiang was well aware that General Diane's brain had nothing to do with whether it had been trampled by horses or not. Wei Fuqing was rendered speechless by this scoundrelly behavior. After carefully weighing his words, he said slowly, "You want the general to go to Liangzhou City to be the administrator, to deal only with official documents all year round, and to ignore all military affairs in Bailiang?" Dian Xiong was stunned. This, from beginning to end, the white-clothed Chen Jibao turned a deaf ear to him. He only turned his head to look at one of Bailiang's newest young generals. His surname was Che, and his name was Yi. He was born in Beimang, but he was a slave of the lowest status. He was skilled in archery and horsemanship, and he was good at fighting. He was originally a man of sacrifice raised by the nobles, but he had committed a heinous crime in Beimang. All the way to the south, he had killed more than 20 Beimang's wolf and eagle guard with one man, one horse, and one bow. This Wolf Fang soldier was already the second best warrior in Beimang, second only to the great Tiger Ben. He was roughly equal to the Iron Soldiers of Bailiang. It must be known how cruel the Iron Soldier selection process was. They were given a short crossbow or a hard iron bow, 20 arrows, a Bailiang saber, and 3 days' worth of food. 5 people in a team were thrown into Beimang's territory. Each person had to cut off 6 heads of Beimang's soldiers before they could return. After that, there were still tests for infantry and cavalry. After Che Yi defected to Bailiang's army, he joined the scouts and immediately became the crossbowman who had beheaded the most people. Last year, he followed Chen Jibao and personally led 600 cavalry to raid Beimang's White Sun City. With one arrow, he shot through a certain member of the Beimang royal family who was patrolling the border. When this kid returned with Chen Jibao, he had a total of 30,000 Beimang cavalrymen hanging on his tail. Taking everything into account, Che Yi was only 19 years old this year. Che Yi was wearing silver armor and holding a helmet in his hand. The wind and sand blew in his face, but he remained motionless. Chen Jibao gently waved his hand, indicating for Che Yi to take 2 steps forward and stand side by side at the top of the city wall. He smiled and said, "Do you think it will rain in this weather?" Dian Xiongnan slapped his forehead. The general was really too much. If he had the time to ask about such trivial matters, he might as well tell old Dian about the administrator. Wei Fuqing rubbed his eyebrows with his thumb and smiled without saying a word. The young Che Yi shook his head and said, reporting to the general, "It won't." Chen Jibao made a sound of acknowledgement and then fell silent again. Dian Xiongnan couldn't bear the loneliness, so he wanted to go down the city wall and train those bastards outside the city. All of a sudden, a crack appeared in the thick black clouds, and a ray of sunlight shone on the city wall. It shone on the white-robed Chen Jibao and the scout Che Yi. Because the latter was wearing silver armor, he immediately shone with golden light, like a divine soldier and celestial general. At this time, howls shook the sky at both ends of the Enma River about 5 kilometers away from the city. There were more than 100 iron chains hanging on the Enma River all year round. At this moment, all of them were pulled taut by the soldiers standing on both sides of the river. It was a tug-of-war between 50 people. Regardless of whether they were soldiers or captains, regardless of whether it was winter or the scorching sun, they all had to bare their upper bodies. Their skin was soft and tender. If they were pulled out once or twice in June or July, their skin would explode. Now that autumn was coming, they could be considered lucky. But in a few months, it would be the worst. According to Bailiang's military rules, how could the loser of a tug-of-war lose? That was to drag the other party into the river with the iron chains. In summer, it could be used as a bath, but in winter, how could it be comfortable to fall into the river? Bailiang's army had many small hills, and the pillar state didn't care about it. However, private fights were prohibited. This was an iron law. If there was friction, it was fine. Either go to the drill ground and have a fierce fight, or each side brought 50 people here for a tug-of-war. When a hunchback old man accompanied by White Bear Yuan Zuozong came down to the Enma River, all the shirtless men instantly felt their blood boil. Oh my God, the great general is here. There was no harmony in a tug-of-war. When the great general returned from the capital to Bailiang, Who the hell wanted to lose face? Su Shao, who wasn't wearing armor, came near a group of 50 Bailiang soldiers with his hands behind his back. He smiled and didn't say anything, just looking at the iron chains across the river. Gradually, people fell into the river from the 100 iron chains. After a whole incense stick's time, only the iron chain beside Su Shao remained across the Enma River. Su Shao squinted and saw that more than half of the 100 people on both sides of the river had blood on their hands. Their shouts were hoarse. Someone on the left bank shouted, "Zhao Taizhu, you didn't drink milk when you were young, right? Stand up for me." Someone on the right bank shouted, "As long as your hands aren't broken, stand up for me one by one. Whoever slacks off first, I'll make you raise your ass when we get back to the barracks." Bastard. Do you really think you're a coward? Come on, kid, didn't you claim to be able to draw a 3-stone bow? This time, beat those bastards on the other side. Huang Qiong, you're the bastard. No one expected that the iron chains would be broken by 2 groups of people. The 100 people were all lying on the ground, unable to move a finger. Their hands were all covered in blood. Su Shao smiled and said, "Okay." No one knew who was the first to shout, but all the soldiers who could still move shouted at the top of their lungs, "Long live the great general! Long live the great general!" The hunchback old man didn't stop them. If he didn't say anything, who would dare to go to the capital? Su Shao turned to look at the top of the city wall and said to himself, "Why are you standing so high up?" Chapter 290. News of the sudden death of 20 riders near Zhejiang City in Yi Province had already spread throughout Mount Hui, and there was no news of their leader, Yuan Tingshan. For a time, all kinds of rumors and slanders were flying around. Some said that Zhao Yi, the prince of Guangling, had mobilized his armored cavalry to steal a woman. Others said that Yuan Tingshan, who was destined to be a lone star, had brought disaster upon himself and had been targeted by Zhao Go, implicating the cavalry team that the clan had spent a great deal of money to train. Others said that the young male and female of the Murong clan were not ordinary people and had the protection of immortals. All kinds of rumors were said, and all kinds of sneaky. Because the old family head had been in closed-door training for many years, and Xianyuan Guiqi, who was in charge of Mount Hui, was having a sword competition with someone at the Dongyue sword pool, the Xianyuan mansion on Bull Mound was without a leader. In addition, there were many factions within the clan to begin with, and the eldest branch and the other branches appeared united in appearance, but were divided at heart, so there was no one who could suppress the growing clamor. Xianyuan Qingfeng was from the eldest branch of the main branch, which was the main branch of the Xianyuan clan. Unfortunately, no matter how much effort the ancestors put in to nurture her father, Xianyuan Jingqing, he was not of much use. What could they do if they couldn't be helped? A large clan also had its advantages. Xianyuan Qingfeng had 2 uncles, Xianyuan Jingqing and Xianyuan Jingxian. One was calm and steady, while the other was determined to make progress. The latter's talent in martial arts was particularly astonishing, and he was only a thin layer of paper away from the realm of grandmasters. It felt like he would break through with a single poke if he dipped his finger in saliva. Therefore, in Xianyuan Jingshuan's line, the mother's status depended on the son's, and the son's glory depended on the father's, so they were domineering in Mount Hui. However, in the entire Mount Hui, the man that Xianyuan Qingfeng least wanted to see was her biological father, the man who only knew how to nod his head and say yes. In an ordinary landowning household, the behavior of the eldest grandson of the main branch might be barely enough to maintain the image of a gentle and well-mannered man. However, this was Bull Mound, and the Xianyuan clan was a martial arts clan that stood on equal footing with the Wu clan and the Lu clan of Western Shu. So what if he was well-read? Could he compare to a pair of fists that could destroy mountains and shake cities? Everyone on the mountain knew that not only did Xianyuan Jingqing grant his only daughter's request, he was also extremely fearful of his wife, and never had the slightest thought of taking in a concubine. Although the Xianyuan clan was so domineering that anyone who wanted to come up the mountain had to change their surname to Xianyuan, and there was no lack of martial arts heroes who married into the Xianyuan clan, but the dignified eldest son of the main branch did not have a single heir to carry on the family name. Even if Xianyuan Qingfeng succeeded in getting a talent to marry into the family in the future, the main branch of the main branch would never be able to lift their heads up high. In these years, there was discord in discord, and many people changed their allegiance to the other two branches that were flourishing with each passing day. Xianyuan Jingxing completely became a loner, and everyone even knew that the wife who gave birth to the eldest grandson of the main branch still loved someone else to this day. At the beginning of their marriage, she made a defiant promise with Xianyuan Jingxing that she would only have one child, and whether it was a son or a daughter would be left to fate. After Xianyuan Qingfeng was born, Xianyuan Jingxing really kept his promise. When Xianyuan Qingfeng was young, she still ignored her mother's gloomy expression that could never be resolved. She felt that her father, who never lost his temper, did not do anything wrong. As she grew older, she finally understood how fatal her father's indifference was in the Xianyuan clan, who had worshipped martial arts for hundreds of years. The older she grew and the more she was exposed to the ways of the world, the more Xianyuan Qingfeng wanted to stay as far away from this mediocre man as possible. When Xianyuan Qingfeng saw Song Kelly off Mount Hui, she naturally felt guilty towards this young phoenix of the Song family. The Song family was a first-class noble family in the dynasty. Moreover, the Song family had only one son in 3 generations. Song Kelly's importance was self-evident. Interacting with Xianyuan Qingfeng was already degrading his status. The Xianyuan clan could do whatever they wanted in Jianghu, but this was not worth mentioning to the important officials of the imperial court. After Xianyuan Qingfeng met Song Kelly, who was escorting the coffin to the south, she used many tricks to get to know him. With Song Kelly's eyesight, he should have seen through it long ago. However, he still didn't mind Xianyuan Qingfeng using him, or rather, using the Song family to show off within the Xianyuan clan. Not only did he come to Mount Hui, but he also seemed to have a pleasant conversation with Xianyuan Jingxing at the Bull Hill, giving Xianyuan Qingfeng a lot of face. Even though Xianyuan Qingfeng didn't have a good impression of scholars, she still felt some inexplicable feelings towards Song Kelly. She didn't know whether it was out of gratitude or admiration. That Yuan Tingshan who was so conceited that he didn't even try to hide his wild ambitions? Xianyuan Qingfeng asked himself, would I feel regret if he really died? Walking down the mountain on the limestone path, Xianyuan Qingfeng glanced at the Six-Fold Sisters waterfall. Song Kelly smiled and said, I learned some physiognomy from my father. It's not easy for Yuan Tingshan to die. His fate is very bad, but he's very tough. Xianyuan Qingfeng was a bit frightened and was about to explain. Song Kelly said gently, Miss Xianyuan, you're overthinking. Xianyuan Qingfeng didn't say anything else. He was afraid that he would add fuel to the fire. The two walked silently on the path. When they reached the foot of the mountain, they saw a boat. Song Kelly suddenly stopped and hesitated for a moment. In the end, he said, Mr. Shoujua is very knowledgeable and has analyzed the 3 doctrines in simple terms. I've been talking with Mr. Shoujua through candlelight for the past few days and have learned a lot. Mr. Shoujua said that learning from reading scriptures is like looking at plum blossoms and drawing pancakes. His words enlightened me. In the past, I remembered my family's teachings to be humble and respectful in all matters and not to be overbearing. However, in the end, I didn't understand why I had to be humble. In the eyes of a wise person, my childish words and actions would only make me a laughing stock. Miss Xianyuan, please forgive me for speaking bluntly, but Mr. Shoujua is definitely not a mediocre person. Xianyuan Qingfeng smiled and didn't think much of it. He only joked, did my father ask you to be a lobbyist? How many books did he give you? Song Kelly was stunned and murmured, a father knows his daughter best. Everything is within Mr. Shoujua's expectations. While Xianyuan Qingfeng was puzzled, Song Kelly turned around and bowed to Bull Gang. He said happily, I admire you. Looking at Song Kelly's back as he boarded the boat, Xianyuan Qingfeng was confused. Chapter 291. Song Kelly stood at the bow of the ship and slowly sailed towards the Shi River. He didn't forget to wave at Xianyuan Qingfeng who was on the shore. After going up the mountain, Song Kelly's bearing was impeccable. Not to mention talking about Buddhism and Taoism with Xianyuan Jingxian, he was also neither servile nor overbearing when exchanging martial arts experiences with Xianyuan Jingxian. In fact, the truth was that Xianyuan Qingfeng didn't need to make any arrangements. He would go to Mount Hui to visit Xianyuan Jingsheng. Putting aside whether this person was hiding something, just his meticulous planning in politics was enough to impress his grandfather. Song Kelly's deceased teacher greatly praised him. Song Kelly went south to Jianzhou to escort the coffin as a disciple, but more importantly, he wanted to test Xianyuan Jingsheng's ability. If he was truly talented, the Song family wouldn't mind promoting a scholar from a common family to help him consolidate his position in the family. If he was only an armchair strategist, Song Kelly could also turn to Xianyuan Jingxian. After all, this power had been rooted in Jianzhou for hundreds of years and could help him do many things that scholars couldn't do. Before going down the mountain, Xianyuan Jingsheng smiled faintly and said, "When the scholar and the butcher become neighbors, let the scholar use his mouth. When fighting, the butcher will use his hands. There's no harm in helping each other." Although this reassurance was not small, it was still not enough for Song Kelly to make up his mind to marry Xianyuan Jingsheng. Marriage between a noble family and a commoner family was a big taboo in the scholarly community, second only to the loss of descendants. The ship sailed into the Shi River and the view was broad. Song Kelly had the impulse to sing a song about the heroism of the great river. Deep down, the young phoenix of the Song family was not very courteous. The ghosts of Xiang Fan cried, the monkeys of Shu Dao cried, and the waves of the river were vast and boundless. He wanted to write a poem to express his feelings. Unfortunately, Song Kelly's family had learned a lot and he was not inferior to a famous scholar. However, during the journey, Song Kelly would send out beautiful poems into the scholarly community every once in a while. The unknown inside story was that many of these poems were written by his father or even his grandfather. How difficult was it for a scholar to become famous? Hoping to write a poem that would shock the world? It was almost impossible. Without the support of the seniors in the literary world, and without the support of the students, no matter how well it was written, it could only be described as passable. Nowadays, the famous works were not famous when they were first published. It was only after hundreds of years of being passed down through generations and generations that they were gradually recognized by the giants in the literary world. Song Kelly could not be more familiar with this. How many Wang Dongxiang were there in the world? What's more, the first snow was a voluminous 500,000 words long. While Song Kelly was having mixed feelings, he saw a tall ship coming towards him. A handsome young man with a sword was standing at the bow of the ship. Beside him was a maid in green and a one-armed old man wearing a sheepskin coat. Song Kelly didn't pay much attention to them and just thought that they were ordinary pilgrims visiting Longhu. Song Kelly stayed in Mount Hui because he wanted to wait for the Bailiang crown prince. Unfortunately, he still had things to do under his father's orders. He couldn't wait any longer. The two tiger kuei that finally didn't have to stay in the carriage played coquettishly at Su Fengnian's feet. Su Fengnian pointed at the bluestone roof of Mount Hui and asked, "Bull's gang?" The old god of swords nodded. Su Fengnian squinted his eyes and rubbed the handle of his spring thunder. Unexpectedly, the operation to capture Xianyuan Yuan Tingshan some time ago had ended in failure. According to Wei Shuyang's detailed description, this Machateman's martial prowess couldn't be considered world-shocking. There was still a large gap between him and the outstanding talents of the younger generation, Qi Xianxia and Wu Luding. However, his intelligence and luck were excellent, so His Highness the heir of the crown wasn't angry. Even though Prince Jinggan, Zhao Heng, had suffered a double loss at the Reed Marsh, how could he not be able to kill Yuan Tingshan? Then there was Yuan Meng's visit to the Hezhou provincial governor with Bailiang's military edict. It was a fact that the Xianyuan family banned people by force. However, the old man ignored it. Looking at his attitude, he didn't even care about Chu Lushan, who had already caused chaos in Xiangfan City. Su Fengnian muttered to himself, "What a tough guy." The old god of swords used his finger to pick a vegetable leaf between his teeth. He grinned and said, "There are as many scholars as there are fish in the river. It's normal to have a few who aren't afraid of death." Su Fengnian didn't comment on this. The boat turned to the foot of Mount Hui. Su Fengnian was in a hurry to go to Mount Longhu, so he didn't want to cause trouble for Xianyuan. He just chatted with the old god of swords. Xianyuan Qingfeng stood at the foot of the mountain for a long time. When she was finally about to turn around and go up the mountain, her delicate eyes suddenly widened. She jogged a few steps and saw the guy standing at the bow of the boat. She was furious. This bastard. She would recognize him even if he was reduced to ashes, let alone changed into luxurious clothes. It was this bastard who claimed to be surnamed Su. He and a wanderer with a wooden sword had humiliated her in every possible way in Wuzhou's lantern market. Xianyuan Qingfeng looked carefully and sneered. Don't think that you can pretend to be a noble just because you swindled a few taels of silver. Without needing Xianyuan Qingfeng to say anything, Su Fengnian, who had been pointing at the scenery of Mount Hui, also saw this woman. He had searched high and low for her, but to no avail. He laughed and steered the boat closer to Mount Hui. He leaned on the railing and looked at Xianyuan Qingfeng, who was less than 10 zhang away. He deliberately mispronounced a word and shouted, "Guliang." Xianyuan Qingfeng didn't care about ladylike etiquette and angrily said, "Surnamed Su. What a heartwarming reunion." Su Fengnian clicked his tongue and said, "Since we parted at the lantern market, how did Guliang gain weight?" Xianyuan Qingfeng gritted her teeth and sneered, "If you have the ability, come to Mount Hui as a guest. Xianyuan Qingfeng will definitely be a good host." Su Fengnian rested his chin on his hand and said with a smile, "You miss me so much?" There was a Xianyuan ship at the foot of the mountain. Xianyuan Qingfeng ran onto the ship and tried to catch up. One ship wasn't in a hurry to escape, while the other chased relentlessly. Soon, the two ships were only 50 zhang apart. Su Fengnian slowly walked to the stern of the ship and suddenly sped up. He leaped onto the railing and shot towards Xianyuan Qingfeng like an arrow. Under her dumbfounded gaze, Su Fengnian stood on the railing of the ship she was on and looked down at this arrogant woman from the Xianyuan family. Su Fengnian glanced at the restless Xianyuan retainers. Just as he was about to speak, something strange happened on the surface of the river. A sloppy old Taoist came over on a raft. The skinny young man on the bamboo raft pursed his lips and gently breathed in and out. One end of the bamboo raft suddenly pierced into the river while the other end was raised high. He used the momentum to bounce onto the ship and spread his legs like a wild horse. Then, with a kick, he actually caused the entire ship to sink. This strength? The young man instantly jumped high and crashed onto the bow of the ship where Xianyuan Qingfeng was standing. The ship shook violently again. Other than the old god of swords, Li Chungang, all the passengers on the two ships were slightly agape. Not to mention this Qinggong, but the strength to cause the ship to sink several feet. After the ordinary-looking skinny young man landed on the ground, he turned around and hugged His Royal Highness's legs tightly. He cried out at the top of his lungs, "Brother!" Chapter 292. The two warships that had accurately calculated the depth of the Green Dragon stream slowed down after the withered young man stepped on them. The Xianyuan family's private warship wanted to quietly increase its speed and keep the two brothers with different appearances on board, but the warship in front would not let it succeed. Swords were drawn and swords were unsheathed, but Xianyuan Qingfeng only saw the withered young man with bamboo-like arms carry brother Su to the back of the bed. He hugged him tightly and refused to let go. The Xianyuan family dominated the southeast Wulin, and those who were qualified to stay on the warship were all elites. After receiving a signal from Xianyuan Qingfeng, the two swordsmen swung their swords like dragons and stabbed the young man's back. They wanted to pierce through the brothers and nail them to the warship's railing like sugar-coated haws. They wanted to show their power to those foreigners who had angered Miss Xianyuan. 2 lives were nothing to Xianyuan. Why had the governor's office of the Sword Province been able to operate smoothly all these years under the suppression of the Prince of Guangling? Wasn't it because they had the full support of the Flood Dragon that had dominated Mount Hui for 500 years? Otherwise, when a scholar encountered a military ruffian, he would have been suppressed by the powerful Prince Zhao Yi to the point that he was worse than a stray dog. Since the governor's office of the Sword Province was mutually beneficial, the governor's office of the Guangling army was not a mediocre person. He had given Xianyuan a great deal of power and authority, and had spared no effort in eliminating dissidents through bloody means. He had secretly supported Xianyuan. Otherwise, How could Mount Hui have cultivated a 200-man private cavalry under the nose of the imperial court? Xianyuan Qingfeng frowned. She clearly saw that Brother Su only touched the young man's head and did not seem to notice the two swords. This was not in line with this guy's cowardly demeanor. Although Huang Manor's heart acupoint was not opened, his sense of danger was probably above that of Yuan Tingshan's. The two swords came at him, but he did not seem to move skillfully. He only turned around and held the sword with both hands. The swordsman suddenly exerted force, wanting to crush the ignorant young man's palm. Huang Manor's face was as ferocious as a vajra. He suddenly twisted, easily twisting the sword as if it was a reed pole. He then pulled it again and rushed forward, dragging the two swordsmen who hesitated and did not have time to let go of their swords in front of him. His two fists smashed into the swordsmen's chests. A thick mist of blood exploded from the swordsmen's chests, and they died on the spot. Their corpses fell into the river like kites with their strings cut. The rest of the Xianyuan men of sacrifice who were originally watching the show saw that the situation was not good. In order to protect Xianyuan Qingfeng, who was standing on the bow, they had to brace themselves and go forward. As a result, the young man was still stabbed between his eyebrows by a sharp sword. He laughed and raised his arms, causing his clothes to flutter. Everyone saw that the sword formed a large arc between the two of them, but it did not pierce between his eyebrows at all. The sallow and emaciated young man stepped on the right foot, raised his left knee, and placed his center of gravity on his right foot. His right foot rotated forward, and his left knee turned inward, and the instep straightened outward. He suddenly jumped into the air and whipped out his lower leg. The force of the kick reached the instep of his foot, and the result was that when the young man landed on the ground, the body of the man of sacrifice was still in the forward position, but his head flew several feet into the air. The young man stretched out his hand to push away the headless corpse, and stared at Xianyuan Qingfeng, whose lips had turned pale. The few men of sacrifice who knew each other well looked at each other and saw the shock and fear in each other's eyes. No wonder this monster could shake the boat with one step. Not to mention the strength of the dragon and elephant, his attack speed was also extremely fast. Damn it, this young man actually had the legendary indestructible body of a vajra? Amidst the dead silence, two supernatural beasts leaped across the river one after another. They were completely red, covered in armor and scales, and dragged their tails behind them. They jumped from the boat in front to the Xianyuan ship, and their front claws just happened to grab onto the railing. After a few struggles, they finally squatted on the railing and bared their fangs and claws. The young man leaned forward and let out an angry roar. Xianyuan Qingfeng was so scared that he staggered back. Outside the ship, a sloppy old Taoist was walking on a raft. Coincidentally, a head smashed towards him, and he rudely slapped it into the river with a bamboo pole. He clicked his tongue and said, "How can a short donkey and a horse bear the stampede of a dragon and elephant?" The old Taoist was like a 1,000-year-old tortoise. He stretched his neck and shouted, "Your Highness, we're about to reach my Xiaoyao temple." Zhao Shituan hesitated for a moment and said with a smile, "Tell Xianyuan Great Pan to stop being a coward. If he doesn't come out, he'll be waiting for his nest to be destroyed." Su Fengnian no longer paid attention to Xianyuan Qingfeng. He pulled Huang Manor and didn't return to the ship. Instead, he jumped onto the bamboo raft, and the two tiger kuei followed closely behind. The King Kong's eyesight was obviously not as good as its sister Bodhisattva's. It directly dove into the water, causing countless splashes. Bodhisattva, who was on the bamboo raft, saw her brother having fun in the river and also jumped down. Su Fengnian smiled and said, "Old Taoist, I didn't say that I'm going to Mount Hui to cause trouble. What are you blindly making a fuss about? Are you planning to divert the trouble from the west to the east?" The old Taoist, who was the quietest and most unknown Taoist in the Taoist master residence, purposely exclaimed in surprise. He was afraid that the eccentric crown prince of Bailiang would turn hostile. To be honest, as the second Taoist master of the Taoist immortal abode, old Taoist Zhao Shituan's seniority in the Taoist orthodoxy could be said to be superior to the 33 heavens. Mount Longhu and Bailiang were separated by thousands of li, so the old Taoist had seen all kinds of storms. When he was in Bailiang's territory, he didn't mind putting his arm around this junior's shoulder. It wasn't necessarily because he was afraid of the great pillar state Su Xiao. It was just that he had a carefree temperament to begin with. When he was young, he was also an extraordinarily frivolous and alcoholic. He was truly a rare talent with great ambition. Otherwise, he wouldn't have left the country to travel far away with his sword. Once he left the mountain, he didn't return to Mount Longhu for a whole 20 years. Now that he met His Royal Highness, who was frivolous and unrestrained, he was quite suitable. If it were Zhao Danxia and Zhao Danping's nephews, one of whom was a minister of Yue and the other a prime minister of Qing Ci, who were together with Crown Prince Su Fengnian, they wouldn't have such an attitude. Su Fengnian glanced at the giggling Huang Manor, then raised his head to look at the old Taoist. He asked in surprise, "You're not afraid of water anymore?" Chapter 293. The old Taoist nodded. "I've been afraid for a long time. Shaoyao Temple is right next to the Green Dragon Stream. I told him to follow the stream to Mount Hui where the Dragon King River enters the Shi River, then keep going north until it reaches the Spring God Lake. We'll be getting closer and closer to Beiliang. I told him that your brother will come to Mount Longhu in autumn. Dragon Elephant will wait for you at the stream if he has nothing to do. Then he won't be afraid of the water anymore." Su Longxiang hit the water with his palm and a big fish was shaken out of the water. Its claws were like hooks. After catching the fish, he looked at his brother and grinned foolishly, as if he was asking for credit. Su Fengnian patted Huang Manor's head and shook his head. "When in Rome, do as the Romans do. Just eat some vegetarian food. Let the fish go." Huang Manor put the fainted fish back into the water, but it was eaten by a tiger kuei chasing after the bamboo raft. Su Fengnian suddenly asked, "Is there an old Taoist called Zhao Huangchao in Mount Longhu?" "A very old senior?" Old Taoist Zhao Shituan thought for a while and shook his head. "There are many century enlightened masters in seclusion on the mountain, but none of them are called Zhao Huangchao." The boats and rafts sailed up leisurely while the Xianyuan cruise ship turned around and returned to the Mount Hui pier. Xianyuan Qingfeng stood at the window of the cabin. His lips were livid and his body was trembling. It was hard to tell if he was scared or angry. She wasn't blind. Although her martial arts talent was mediocre, she had a good memory and was outstanding on Mount Hui. No matter how complicated the moves were, she would never forget them. To put it nicely, Mount Hui was a place where people from all walks of life accepted talents. To put it bluntly, it was a place where people of all walks of life lived together. The Xianyuan family had a rich collection of books. Other families and sects regarded them as treasures, but the aspiring tripod pavilion in Mount Hui had countless books. In terms of the number of books, it was only inferior to the Tide Listening Pavilion in Beiliang. Yuan Tingshan said he wanted to marry her because he saw her as a shortcut to the peak of martial arts. Even if she couldn't enter the aspiring tripod pavilion, as long as Xianyuan Qingfeng personally taught her, all problems would be solved. How could Xianyuan Qingfeng not see how terrifying the yellow-skinned youth was? Perhaps in the entire Hui Mountain, there were no more than 10 people who could create such a huge commotion. If the invincible Vajra behind the youth was included, the number of people who could be counted on one hand. That was fine. This unfamiliar word made Xianyuan Qingfeng's heart tremble. After the spring and autumn period, although the title of crown prince had a tendency to spread in the dynasty, as long as one was a legitimate son of a noble family or a bastard son, they were qualified to hold this title. However, the title of crown prince became more and more precious. Only the princes and princesses of the imperial family could be called crown prince. In the southeast of the dynasty, according to the law, only the descendants of Zhao Yi, the crown prince of Guangling, could be considered crown prince. Zhao Yi had 3 sons and 6 daughters. The crown prince, Zhao Yu, hadn't been hereditary. Speaking of which, it was strange. It was probably due to the heavenly Tao's retribution that the lecherous Zhao Yi had snatched countless beauties. The 7 concubines who had broken the rules were all beautiful enough to captivate the birds and beasts. However, their children all resembled Zhao Yi. All of them had big heads and ears, and were as fat as pigs. They did not inherit the looks of the concubines at all. If that was the case, who was the fellow whom the Longhu Taoist addressed as Your Highness? There was no need to doubt the identity of Crown Prince. If he wasn't a descendant of a crown prince, who would dare to bring elite soldiers with him? Even the powerful Guangling Duke, Zhao Yi, would not hand over such information to the imperial court. His children leaving the duke's manor to play was even more relaxed than ordinary families. His surname was Su. Xianyuan Qingfeng's face was pale. After all, Xianyuan was one of the top aristocratic families and was well informed. She also heard that the eldest son of Su Shao, who had a different surname, traveled for 3 years before returning to Beiliang to avoid marrying into the crown prince's family. For some reason, he went out again this time. Not long ago, he caused trouble in Gangnam-do. Thousands of scholars from the Imperial College in the capital clamored for the emperor to issue an edict to Jiangnan. Otherwise, the country would be in chaos and the law would be against the law. Unfortunately, the butcher who took away the title of pillar of the country was still favored by the emperor and protected his royal highness. As long as the king of Beiliang was in the capital, no official above the 4th rank dared to impeach him. Only the scholars of the Imperial College wrote tearful letters in blood, which made them a joke. Xianyuan Qingfeng still remembered the arrogance of the Beiliang cavalry under Mount Longhu when the older generation of Mount Hui talked about it. At that time, it wasn't because of her family's righteousness, but because after the iron hooves flattened Mount Longhu, they were intimately interdependent. Xianyuan also didn't have a good ending, so she had to bite the bullet and stand with the Taoist priests of Mount Longhu. If it really was the crown prince of Beiliang, what should she do? It was fine if she had to swallow this anger, but if that beggar turned into Crown Prince Su came to Mount Hui to denounce her, how would her family deal with it? Her father was cowardly and would definitely be too scared to argue. Because of her father's decline in power, the other branches wouldn't hit him when he was down. Her family originally wanted to marry her to Zhao Yi's 6 sons, but because of Song Kelly's arrival, there was a slight silence. Once her uncle Xianyuan smelled the opportunity, how could he show mercy? Who didn't know that this uncle had openly teased her mother, saying, "The dumplings are delicious, but not as delicious as sister-in-law." Her father only knew how to study behind closed doors, so how could he say anything about it? Was there a lack of such jokes? Xianyuan Qingfeng walked out of the cabin in a daze when the boat docked. A lone boat shot over. An old Confucian scholar with white hair flew across the river and landed at the bow of the boat. The boat was filled with spiritual energy as it slowly approached the riverbank. Seeing the only old man in her family who cared about her, Xianyuan Qingfeng's eyes welled up with tears. The old man with an ancient sword at his waist said kindly, "Who dares to bully my granddaughter? Which family's brat is it? Grandpa will teach him a lesson for you." Xianyuan Qingfeng lowered his head and didn't say anything. The old man smiled and said, "It can't be the crown prince of Beiliang who went to Jianzhou, right? This is going to be troublesome." Xianyuan Qingfeng raised his head, his face full of shock. The old man who returned from the Dongyue sword pool was Xuanyuan's national weapon. Rumor had it that he could ride a sword for 100 feet and decapitate someone. His sword skills were outstanding in the southeast. Even the Dongyue sword pool, whose sword skills were second only to the Wu family's sword tomb, saw him as their number 1 threat. The old man said proudly, "So what if he's the crown prince of Beiliang? Can he bully my granddaughter? I'd like to see if that one-armed Li Chun gang can still open the gates of heaven with his sword." Chapter 294. I'll update tomorrow. 3 guaranteed, 4 guaranteed. They could already see the Shaoyao temple by the Green Dragon stream. The big boat and the bamboo raft slowly docked together. Before getting off the raft, Huang Manor bent down and turned to look at Su Fengnian, indicating that he wanted to carry his brother. Su Fengnian smiled and shook his head. The old Taoist Zhao Shituan felt a little sad. The Zhongding family was cold-blooded. There were several brothers who loved each other so much. Thinking about it carefully, the Su family had few male descendants. The second son, Su Longxiang, was born mentally retarded. Of course, the 2 princesses were destined to be married off. In this way, the Beiliang palace would not leave any room for outsiders to interfere in the succession. Anyway, the eldest son, Su Fengnian, would be the heir. No matter how idle His Royal Highness was, there was no suspense. On the other hand, the Zhao family is the first Taoist master's residence in the South Kingdom. Although there is an ancestral rule that only Zhao can be a Taoist master, Qi Xuanzhen suppressed the Taoist master's residence 50 years ago. Now, in the Jing generation, there is Mr. White Lotus in immortality and Qi Xianxia in martial arts. They are all outsiders. No matter if it is fated chances or Taoist spells, the Zhao family can't compete with them at all. During these years, they have been scheming against each other. If the Taoist master's residence didn't worry about the strength of the main branch, Zhao Danping wouldn't have become the ridiculous prime minister. Zhao Shituan sighed worriedly. A group of people walked along the bluestone path to the Shaoyao temple. In the past, the old Taoist master lived alone in the Taoist temple, so there was no such path. After Su Longxiang went up the mountain, the old and the young had nothing to do, so they paved the path. Zhao Shituan hesitated for a moment and approached the old man wearing a sheepskin fur coat. He smiled and said in a low voice, "Old Li, how have you been?" The old god of swords snorted. Li Chungang had visited Longhu twice in his life, and both times, he met Zhao Shituan, who was about the same age as him. As a result, he was pestered by Zhao Shituan. The first time, it was Zhao Shituan who led him to the devil-slaying platform. Li Chungang did not have a bad impression of this guy, who was highly regarded by both the old Taoist master and Qi Xuanzhen. Everyone in the Taoist master's residence was as old-fashioned as clay statues, with neither immortal nor human aura. Li Chungang had already scolded them for being neither human nor ghost. He remembered that the first time he went down the mountain, this Taoist master's residence finally had an unrestrained young Taoist, who insisted on following him to Jianghu for several months. Zhao Shituan Taoist master said shamelessly, "Old Li, my kung fu is far worse than yours." Li Chungang thought of Jiang and his own difficulties in accepting a disciple. His Achilles heel was poked and he was furious. He pointed at Su Fengnian and glared at Zhao Shituan. "Look, my new disciple. Even if Su Longxiang becomes invincible in the future, do you think he can beat this old man's disciple?" Old Taoist Zhao was angry at first. Back then, when the Taoist nuns on the mountain heard that Li Chungang had come to the mountain, they all rushed to the devil-slaying platform like crazy, screaming as if they had seen an immortal descending to the mortal world. Zhao Shituan thought that when he was young, he was also very handsome. Although Li Chungang's kung fu was a little higher than his, he was a little more handsome, and he was a little more famous. This group of women who were supposed to be pure and devoted to the Yellow Court would not be so crazy. However, at that time, Li Chungang held his sword and came with an unparalleled momentum. Zhao Shituan was not convinced. Until today, it was not that old Taoist Zhao thought that he could beat Old Li in a fight, but when it came to competing with disciples, Zhao Shituan was confident that no one dared to jump out and compete with him. But no matter how much he thought about it, he did not expect Elder Li to bring up His Highness the Crown Prince. The old Taoist was immediately discouraged. There was no way to compare. Even if Su Longxiang was really ruthless and dared to drag Wang Xianji down, how could he be unreasonable to His Highness the Crown Prince? Li Chungang was in a good mood when he saw that Zhao Shituan was defeated. He patted Zhao Shituan's shoulder and comforted him. "Maybe Su Longxiang is the reincarnation of Zhenwu Great Emperor. Such a good thing hasn't happened for at least 700 or 800 years. You're lucky to have picked up such a good deal." Old Sword God changed the topic and said with a smile, "Now that you have a beautiful wife, you should be happy in your bed. If you dare to show off in front of this old man, Zhao Shituan, who had once roamed the Jianghu with the god of swords Li Chungang in the same era, immediately saw the wind and said flatteringly, "Brotherly, you're treating me like an outsider. We've been friends for decades." Li Chungang said bluntly, "Don't try to worm your way into being friends with this old man. We don't have any friendship." Zhao Shituan sighed with a melancholy expression. He was too embarrassed to stick his warm face to old Li's cold butt. He turned to look at the troops brought by His Royal Highness. Other than old Li and 100 light cavalry, as well as a few personal retainers who could be considered top-notch in martial arts, there was no other force to be used. Looking at the signs, they did not intend to stir up trouble in Mount Longhu. This was a good thing. Otherwise, he would be stuck in the middle of both sides and would be in a dilemma. While Zhao Shituan was muttering to himself, he caught a glimpse of the three women in curtained hats. Then he saw the maid in green and the beauty holding the cat behind His Highness the Crown Prince. They all had the style of immortal women. The old Taoist pondered over His Highness the Crown Prince's good fortune. In the southeast, only old man Xianyuan, who enjoyed the good fortune of the land alone, and Prince Guangling, Zhao Yi, who collected beauties from all over the world, could compare. Su Fengnian walked to the door of the Taoist temple and stopped. Zhao Shituan's expression was ugly. He admitted that he was in the wrong. It was not easy to trick Su Longxiang from Beiliang to Mount Longhu, but in the end, he was cultivating in this dilapidated Taoist temple. He was really embarrassed. Just as he was thinking about how to explain to His Royal Highness, Su Fengnian, who had never treated the old Taoist master as an expert, slowly turned around and faced Zhao Shituan, bowing deeply. Zhao Shituan was flustered. He was pleasantly surprised, but also fearful and restrained. He hurriedly helped him up and said, "I don't deserve such courtesy from your highness. It's too much." Chapter 295. The old god of swords looked on coldly from the sidelines. He was still a little surprised in his heart. Li Chungang, who had experienced many hardships, had long since figured out Su Fengnian's temperament. Now that he had bowed so openly and sincerely, it could be considered that he had given Zhao Shituan and Mount Longhu enough face. Otherwise, given Su Fengnian's stubborn personality, he would have fought to the death even if he had provoked some king of Jing'an, Zhaoheng, or some scholarly group of Gangnam-do. Yu Yue held Wu Mainyang between her breasts. The white cat was comfortably pretending to be asleep and half awake. Occasionally, it would use its furry head to rub its perky bosom. Princess Jing'an did not know Zhao Shituan's identity, but she guessed from the scene that this foolish youth was Su Fengnian's younger brother, the future prince of Beiliang. She could not imagine that the two brothers of the Marquis clan could get along so well. As for why the young prince was cultivating with a sloppy old Daoist in a shabby monastery at the foot of Mount Longhu, Pei Nanwei did not bother to make wild guesses. What shocked Zhao Shituan even more was the following scene. After His Royal Highness bowed with his hands clasped, the White Horse Cavalry, led by Ningame, gripped the hilts of their Beiliang sabers with their right hands and crossed their left arms before their chests. They took a step back in unison as a sign of respect. Everyone knew that the Beiliang cavalry were the best in the world, arrogant because of their proficiency in battle. During the Spring and Autumn War, when they traveled with Gu Jiantang and the other vassal armies, they always took the lead and no one dared to cut in. Throughout the Spring and Autumn War, only once did the Beiliang army give way to a scholar-led brigade that achieved great merit. Within the Northern Liang army, this tradition had always been passed down. Those who did not have great military exploits would have to give way to those who had great military exploits. Even if it was a military officer with a high military rank, he would have to give way to those who had great military exploits. For example, the scouts who accumulated their reputation by killing the barbarians' heads, even if they were just low-level armored soldiers, in Beiliang's military towns, even if they ran into border officials at the level of county governor, they could still advance on the official road without getting off their horses or bending down. Zhao Shituan sighed inwardly. His Royal Highness had changed. It was a good thing for him, but it might not be a good thing for Mount Longhu, especially the Celestial Master residence. The old Daoist brought the group into the Daoist temple with mixed feelings. Su Fengnian, who was sitting beside the secluded ancient well with Su Longxiang, smiled and said, "Old Celestial Master, please help me arrange the Phoenix Battalion." Zhao Shituan nodded and said, "There's no need for your highness to say anything. Mount Longhu will naturally make the appropriate arrangements." Su Fengnian joked, "I heard that this Daoist ancestral temple, Yuzhang Qinglin, was imposing, and that the East sect was like the heavenly gate. Old Celestial Master, your temple is deserted to a whole new level." Zhao Shituan blushed with shame and smiled. "My social relations are poor. There's nothing I can do about it. I've made His Royal Highness laugh." Su Fengnian waved his hand and said, "In any case, Huang Man doesn't care about this. I see that he's quite happy here. It's not any worse than when he was in Bailiang Palace. Isn't that right, Huang Man? Su Longxiang grinned foolishly. On this side, they kept talking about His Highness, Bailiang, and the old celestial master. The authorities were calm and indifferent, accustomed to it. As a result, the Murong siblings, who were outside the situation and were kept in the dark, were greatly frightened. Although Murong Tongwang had long expected that Su Fengnian's identity was very special, no matter how he thought about it, he felt that being able to rank with Chu Lushan in the front line was already extremely shocking. For the remnants of the spring and autumn period, specifically in the provincial capital, the most unforgettable thing for the Bailiang army was undoubtedly the ghost city of Xiangfan, which had been completely massacred after the city was breached. There was also Jianzhou, where the western lady sat. Longhu and Xianyuan faced each other from east to west. How could they forget the humiliation brought by the Bailiang's iron armor? Murong Wuzhu was in high spirits. She was overjoyed when she mistakenly thought that she had caught a thin straw in the wind and waves, only to discover that it was a towering tree. It was like she had accidentally fallen in love with a poor scholar, only to find out that the scholar was the heir of a wealthy family after eloping with him. Murong Tongwang could not help but tremble. His face was flushed, and he stared at His Royal Highness with a complicated expression. Other than the master of the Wudong Palace, who in the world was the most feared figure in the world by Jiangdong and Xianyuan? It was Bailiang. Su Xiao, the butcher of Jianghu. Blue Bird and Yu Yuwei went to the Taoist temple to clean up the house. Pei Nanwei had to lower her head under the eaves. Most of the time, she was no different from a maid. She had already accepted her fate. Ningame and the others were taken to the nearby Taoist temple by the old Taoist master Zhao Shituan. The old god of swords went to take a walk by the green dragon stream alone. In the end, only the brothers and siblings with different identities were left in the courtyard. Su Fengnian touched Huang Man's head and glanced at Murong Tongwang, who was looking straight at him. Murong Wuzhu was peeping at His Royal Highness, but soon he lowered his head and looked at his feet. His Royal Highness said calmly, "You finally know my identity?" Murong Tongwang bit his lips. Su Fengnian smiled and said, "Did you pee in your pants?" Murong Tongwang was stunned. Su Fengnian smiled and said, "If Wen Hua was here, he would definitely say that I peed in my pants." Murong Wuzhu did not feel disgusted when he heard such frivolous words. He just felt unbearably shy. His ears and neck were red, and he did not dare to look at His Royal Highness, who had a prominent identity. Murong Tongwang could still hold on and looked at Su Fengnian from beginning to end. Su Fengnian thought for a while and said with a naughty smile, "I do have a little grudge with the Xianyuan family, but don't think that you can just watch the flood leisurely. When the time comes, you will go to the Bull Gang to discuss the Xianyuan family. I'll have to trouble you and your brother to cooperate and act closer to me." Murong Wuzhu quietly raised his head and quickly lowered it. Murong Tongwang asked straightforwardly, "Are you really the Prince of Bailiang? The eldest son of the King of Bailiang?" Su Fengnian nodded and said, "Otherwise, would I dare to use 100 light cavalry to slaughter 20 Xianyuan cavalry?" Murong Tongwang smiled. Sure enough, he was more charming than a woman. He slowly walked toward His Royal Highness. Su Fengnian quickly raised his hand and said with a frown, "Don't do this, I can't stand it. How can I be looked at by a man?" "Fine, when we go to Mount Hui, your sister will be the only one to suffer. Let's make it clear in advance that I am taking advantage of you. There is no room for discussion. However, if you shamelessly snuggle up to me, I will always feel that you are taking advantage of me. Both of us will have goosebumps." Murong Wuzhu covered her mouth and let out a soft and light laugh. Murong Tongwang was stunned and turned around. Murong Wuzhu were laughing and crying. Perhaps to an outsider, it was just a crying and laughing scene, but to the Murong siblings, it was 10 years of bitterness and sorrow. Su Fengnian said calmly, "Don't be in a hurry to be grateful. The reason why I helped you is because I feel that you are pitiful. Of course, if you feel that you can't repay me, you can also repay me with your body." Murong Wuzhu plucked up her courage and looked at him in a daze. Su Fengnian smiled, but soon, he couldn't smile anymore. Murong Tonghuang, who had tears on his cheeks, turned his head and asked, "Can't I?" Su Fengnian had the intention to kill. He made a chopping gesture and said angrily, "Murong Tonghuang, if you dare to discuss me again, I will chop off that part of yours. When we go to Wudong Palace in the capital, I guarantee that you will be justified." Su Fengnian's heart skipped a beat as he recalled the prophetic ballad. Overturning a country? Could this guy really do something that millions of soldiers from the 8 countries couldn't do? Chapter 296. Chapter 1. Su Fengnian had just asked Murong Xiongzhu if she had been scared to the point of wetting herself. Soon, he was frightened by his own thoughts. Those beauties with elegant clothes beside the emperor in the smoke of spring and autumn, no matter if they were the empress who had caused the emperor's relatives to rise to power or the concubines who had seduced the emperor, they were nothing more than scapegoats. The scholars who had lost their country and were loyal to the former emperor did not dare or did not know to get to the bottom of the matter. They could not see the root of the problem and could only use poems and articles to vent their anger on those beautiful women. They used the excuse that demons and monsters had come into being. In the eyes of discerning people, it was absurd and unreasonable. Murong Tonghuang was a beautiful young man who could not even defeat the Xianyuan family. How could he collapse a prosperous dynasty? Su Fengnian, who had come back to his senses, laughed at himself. The imperial harem had Zhao Ji as the mother of the country. This empress's iron fist was not inferior to that of a famous general. No matter what, there would not be chaos. In the capital, there was that emperor who was adept at controlling all factions and parties. Inside, there was the empress who was recognized as virtuous to take care of the inner chamber. Outside, there were civil and military officials and generals who looked at all directions. What a big iron bucket of country. The thin-skinned and shallow Murong Wuzhu was short of breath. She carefully sized up this young man whom she had only known for a dozen years. His Royal Highness in Beiliang? How high was his official position? Murong Wuzhu did not understand these things. She only occasionally heard some bad comments about Beiliang when she was socializing with the scholars of Jianzhou. They said that the king of Beiliang was a tyrannical executioner who had killed the most people in the dynasty. He used to like slaughtering cities. As for the eldest son, he was very foppish. He could not write or fight. He only knew how to bully good women in Beiliang. Sooner or later, he would lose the family property and was not worth mentioning. No matter how simple Murong Wuzhu was, she knew that seeing was believing. First impressions were the strongest. She had a good impression of Su Fengnian, who had saved her and her brother. Under the premise that he was in control of their lives, he could resist the temptation and did not bully them. This was 100 times better than those aristocratic scholars who were full of benevolence, righteousness, and morality but secretly had obscene eyes. She was so simple. In the past, she had accepted her fate to be captured and played by ancestor Xianyuan. Now, she accepted her fate to warm the bed for His Royal Highness one day. Murong Wuzhu looked at the handsome face. Even if she took 1,000 steps back, he was very good-looking when he was young, wasn't he? Among the siblings, Murong Tonghuang, who was the one who made the decisions since childhood, saw the look in his sister's eyes and felt helpless. Su Fengnian was extremely disgusted with the scholarly men's penchant for cutting off their sleeves. Of course, he kept a respectful distance from Murong Tonghuang. However, he quite liked this guy's unscrupulous ruthlessness in order to achieve his goal. He was truly ruthless if he dared to be ruthless to himself. If a man could endure the disgust and throw flirtatious glances at another man, he would be unlucky to be born in a small family. If he was given a bigger stage, he would be good at dancing. Since Murong Tonghuang's words and actions were straightforward, Su Fengnian couldn't disappoint him. He gently kicked away the tiger Kuei King Kong who was biting his robe and said with a smile, "If you want to use Beiliang's tiger skin as a banner to intimidate others, you don't need to hide it. Since I've eaten my fill and have nothing better to do, I won't be so shameless. However, I'll say the ugly words first. At least we're in the same camp now." Don't stab me in the back and think about giving Mount Hui a proof of your allegiance. We can't let you and your sister take all the good things. Murong Tong Wang nodded and said gloomily, after we stepped out of the family, we didn't think about going to the Xianyuan family to live an ignoble existence. However, since His Royal Highness said so, I also hope that Your Highness won't use us to win over Mount Hui. If so. Su Fengnian waved his hand and shook his head, then you're underestimating me, Su Fengnian. Murong Wuzhu whispered softly, Su Fengnian? Su Fengnian said with a smile, isn't the name nice? A phoenix won't perch unless it's a parasol tree. You two are quite fated, right? My courtyard in Bailiang Palace is called Parasol Garden. If you have the chance, you can go there and play. Don't worry, I really don't have any thoughts about you two. I also feel that it's a waste of saliva to keep talking about this. In the future, don't be on guard against this. Do you see the big sister holding the white cat? I like her. If we're talking about her face and smooth skin, then big sister Pei, or Aunt Pei, who wears the veil hat with you two, is definitely more outstanding than you two. You two are guarding against me like you're guarding against a thief. It's very hurtful. Murong Wuzhu giggled. As a result, she was glared at by Murong Tonghuang, but this time, she didn't shrink back for the first time. Su Fengnian looked at Murong Tonghuang and said helplessly, you can't protect your sister for the rest of her life. She has to get married and take care of the family alone. When that time comes, don't tell me that you're still following behind your sister. Aren't you afraid that your future brother-in-law will dislike you for being an eyesore? Murong Tonghuang coldly snorted and said, that'll have to wait until she finds that kind of man. Once she finds that kind of man, it's fine even if she wants me to die. Chapter 297. Su Fengnian was speechless. He could only turn around and smile at Huang Manor. In the next few days, His Royal Highness unexpectedly did not go to the Taoist Master Mansion, nor did he go to the Mount Hui Miao Gang. He stayed at Xiaoyao Temple obediently. He would either ask the old god of swords about the flaws in his life-saving saber techniques or ask the old Taoist master about the essence of the talismans in Mount Longhu. Especially the latter, he rarely met a junior at the foot of the mountain who was willing to let His Royal Highness enjoy being his master. He told him everything he knew. During this period, he especially went to the library at the top of the mountain and brought down many Taoist cloud talisman's secret scriptures. The old and the young talked until dawn. Probably because he was afraid that His Royal Highness would say that he did not know anything, Zhao Shituan even picked up a few talisman incantations that were feared by ordinary Taoists. While he was cramming, he explained the mysteries to His Royal Highness. It should be known that Zhao Shituan was very talented when he was young. Unfortunately, he had the same problem as the Xianyuan Great Plate. In every field, he did not ask for in-depth knowledge. After being provoked by His Royal Highness, he gritted his teeth and even piled the extremely obscure book of Taishang Jingyi Dongxian Law collection on the table. On this day, Su Fengnian finally stopped strolling around at the foot of the mountain. He pulled Huang Man'er, called Murong Wuzhu, and Murong Tonghuang to go to the back of the mountain behind a Taoist temple. Only Qing Miao followed them, holding a bamboo basket. Murong Wuzhu was probably careless that day, but after confiding in His Highness, who was wearing a tiger skin, she was much more at ease than her younger brother. She softly asked, Your Highness, what are you doing? Huang Man'er said honestly, picking hawthorns. Su Fengnian nodded and smiled. When the old Taoist master went to Bailiang to take my brother as a closed-door disciple, he talked for a long time but did not get to the point. Only hawthorns are more pleasing to Huang Man'er. Murong Wuzhu felt that this was unimaginable. Su Fengnian picked a hillside and sat down. Huang Man'er came and went like the wind. One handful of hawthorn after another, he quickly filled up the small bamboo basket. Blue Bird simply placed the bamboo basket on the ground. Murong Wuzhu was still at a lively age, so she went to pick the hawthorn with Blue Bird. Su Fengnian and Murong Tonghuang were sitting at a distance from each other, while the two tiger kuei were rolling all over the mountain. A cool breeze brushed past his face. Su Fengnian closed his eyes and concentrated. He stroked the overlapping spring thunder-embroidered winter and let his imagination run wild. The stones of other mountains could be used to improve jade. Even with the help of the 9 bushels of rice Wei Shuyang, it was still difficult to study the cloud pattern of the Fujiang red armor. However, after the guidance of the old Taoist master Zhao Shituan, many of the obstacles were easily killed by the sloppy old Taoist who knew the secrets of heaven. This made him suddenly enlightened. The only pity was that he lacked a Buddhist monk who knew the secret. Otherwise, Su Fengnian was confident that he could completely turn the Fujiang red armor into something in his pocket. Murong Tongwang asked softly, "I heard that your Royal Highness killed many scholars in Gangnam-do." Su Fengnian said calmly, "Compared to Su Shao, it's still much less." Murong Tongwang frowned, "Why do you want to go against scholars? Don't you know that public opinion can confuse gold and make you and your father go down in history and infamy?" Su Fengnian wiped the spring thunder with his slender fingers and said slowly, "The winner takes all. Think about it, the history books of the 8 kingdoms of spring and autumn were all written by the historians of the Liang dynasty. For those who wanted their ancestors to be known as loyal ministers, even if they only left a dozen words for their descendants, they would not hesitate to become officials in the new imperial court. For those who wanted their fathers not to be known as traitorous ministers, they would even rush to the capital and rack their brains to please the Hanlin emperor. They would cry and shout, wishing that they could present their wives and concubines with both hands. Isn't there a ridiculous story of someone who asked his wife to take off her clothes to warm his hands with her breasts?" Murong Tongwang said seriously, "Your Royal Highness, you can't generalize." Su Fengnian opened his eyes and said calmly, "I understand this. It's not that Su Shao didn't admire scholars from the bottom of his heart, but it seems that not many of them had a good ending. Sun Ping of Hezhou, who submitted the 21 treatises on governance, was cooked by the people. Zhao Guangling vomited blood and died in the military tent outside the West Shu imperial city. Li Shan, who used to be a judge of civil and military affairs, was killed by some literary giants who were also scholars. He was implicated and finally escaped to Su Zhao's side to survive. Of course, you can continue to say that this is a generalization. However, as a member of the Northern Liang Mansion, I have seen the graceful bearing of many famous people. Indeed, they can write beautiful poems. Regardless of whether it is killing with words or singing praises, they are all top-notch. Fame and fortune, fame and fortune. Do you know why the name comes before the word fortune? Saint Zhang of the North once said that there were 3 immortals. The first was to establish virtue, the second was to establish one's words, and the third was to establish merit. This was the answer, and also the basis of why scholars look down on martial artists. How many scholars went to establish virtue? Studying back and forth, the most they did was to establish their words. Establishing one's words, accumulating one's character, earning fame, bringing honor to one's ancestors, leaving one's name in the annals of history, how could they care about the people's hunger? Su Fengnian said softly, "When I was in Gangnam-do Baogwa Temple, I heard the famous scholars of Jiangnan talk about righteousness and profit. In the end, it was just a poor scholar who originally didn't have the qualifications to enter the banquet who sought profit for the people. What kind of scholars do you think those famous scholars are? They only know how to recite the wind, the flower, the snow and the moon, talk about profound mysteries, and if the whole world applauds, is it really good? Reading 10,000 books, there's no book that you don't read, no scriptures that you don't understand. Don't you know that there is a frozen bone outside the Vermilion Gate? Is that a scholar? Su Fengnian laughed and said, "You might not believe it, but after Xiang Fan Confucian Wang Yangming committed suicide, he was originally at the top of the list of traitorous officials. It was Su Shao who had a quarrel with the old Grand Secretary, rolled up his sleeves and personally cut it off. And the history books of West Chu did not leave half a word about this scholar who once sat alone on the fishing platform for West Chu for 10 whole years. This time, it was the old leader of the imperial court, West Chu's old grand preceptor Sun Shiji who personally erased it." Murong Tongwang was still persisting, but he was no longer as confident as he was at the beginning. Lowering his head, he said, "Scholars are still mostly good people." Su Fengnian said self-deprecatingly, "I didn't say that I have to make life difficult for scholars. Besides, there are a lot of people and things that have no right or wrong to speak of. If we get into a dead end and insist on either one or the other, then there's no reason to speak of. Murong Tong Huang grunted. Su Fengnian propped his chin on his hand and looked toward the bull, De Gang. He muttered to himself, that kid Wen Hua is still open-minded. I wonder where he is right now. Murong Tong Huang was in a daze, lost in thought. Su Fengnian turned his head and stretched out 2 fingers. Imitating the Taoist priests of the charm and spell sect who subdued demons and exorcised devils, he pointed at Murong Tong Huang. Laughing heartily, he joked, urgent as the law commands, "You evil creature who brings disaster to the country and the people, why haven't you shown yourself yet?" Chapter 298. Chapter 2. Murong Tong Huang hesitated for a moment and hammered His Royal Highness's chest with all his might. At this moment, he no longer pretended to be seductive and charming, nor was he gloomy. Instead, he exuded an unfamiliar aura of awe-inspiring heroism. Su Fengnian lay on the slope and said with a smile, "Qin Yu, who is ranked 2nd in the Rouge ranking, is said to not lose to Nangong. Do you know that?" Murong Tong Huang nodded, but he was confused as to why Meng Qi mentioned Qin Yu and Nangong. Su Fengnian said with a smile, "That Nangong is the same as you. He is a man with a white fox face. He is even more good-looking than you. Now he is reading secret manuals in the tide-listening pavilion of Bailiang Palace. When he comes out of the pavilion, he might be the number 1 in the world. These 2 sabers of mine, Spring Thunder and Embroidered Winter, were originally his. Later, I gave one to him and borrowed the other." Murong Tong Huang laughed and said, "If you continue to explain, be careful that you don't say that you are trying to hide 300 taels of silver." Su Fengnian felt relieved. There were thousands of knots in his heart. If he could help this pair of siblings untie one by one, he would deal with the mess of the Xianyuan family. As for Murong Tong Huang's life, he only needed to lay down some foreshadowing. After that, he would no longer pay attention to him. He really needed to learn from that old monster Huang Sanja to play chess. Regardless of whether he was drawing a tiger or a dog, he needed to learn first. Su Fengnian suddenly thought of the celestial being from Mount Longhu, Zhao Huangchao, who came by dragon in his dream. This Zhao was not the Zhao from the Zhao family of the Taoist master mansion. Su Fengnian still had not figured out whether it was a dream or reality. If it was the truth, why didn't Miss Hehe, who was climbing the cliff all night long, respond? Even the old god of swords, Li Chungang, did not notice it. However, if he were to treat it as a dream, then everything the white python told the black dragon and the middle-aged Taoist priest, Zhao Huangchao, said was reasonable and well-founded, especially the bearded heavenly dragon that rose from the cliff. It was almost exactly the same as the one in the evil Spring Thunder Flood dragon painting. This painting of the heavenly king and the heavenly maiden came from the hands of a great Qi practitioner and was supplemented by an ominous prophecy. Su Fengnian frowned. For the time being, he did not dare to mention this strange matter to anyone. Perhaps he would only be able to mention it to Su Shao and Li Shan once he returned to Bailiang. His Royal Highness didn't know that not long ago, someone had coincidentally arrived at Mount Insignia. Xianyuan Qingfeng and his grandfather, Xianyuan Guiqi, were standing on the Wangjiang terrace of the aspiring cauldron pavilion. The 2 of them were leaning against the railing. The aspiring cauldron pavilion was built against the cliff, while the Wangjiang terrace was abrupt. The mountain wind was blowing, and it was very cold at the top. Xianyuan Qingfeng pulled the collar of his fur coat. The old man with white hair on his temples smiled and said, "Are you cold? You mischievous girl. You're just like your father. Both of you are unwilling to work hard on the path of martial arts. Practicing martial arts doesn't necessarily mean you have to fight and kill. Strengthening your body is fundamental." Xianyuan Qingfeng's cheeks were flushed from the strong wind from the river to the wall of Bull Mound. He shrunk his neck and said coquettishly, "It's not too late to learn now." Xianyuan Guiqi, who had an ancient sword hanging from his waist, smiled but didn't say anything. The old man was the only son of Xianyuan of Mount Insignia's generation. After his ancestor, Xianyuan Great Plate, suffered defeat after defeat, he went into seclusion to cultivate. It was Xianyuan Guiqi who single-handedly supported him. When he was young, he was a nobody. He missed the opportunity to fight Li Chungang, the god of swords, who was known as the invincible god of swords. It was only in the recent 20 years that he rose to fame. His first battle after leaving the mountain was the toughest Wu family's sword tomb as a whetstone, forcing the Wu family's Su of Gojoseon to unsheath his sword. Although Xianyuan Guiqi was defeated, it was still a glorious defeat. He was praised by the martial arts world as a late bloomer. All the friends he had made over the years were old. Not long ago, he went to the Dongyue sword pool and defeated 6 sword puppets with 1 strike. His reputation was right behind Dong Tai's. Xianyuan Guiqi said softly, "I heard that Li Chungang is by the side of the crown prince of Bailiang." The old man flicked the scabbard with his finger, and the ancient sword in the scabbard hummed, even louder than the whistling of the mountain wind. However, Xianyuan Qingfeng did not react at all. The old man sneered and said, "Li Chungang used to be a sword immortal. When did he become a lackey of the Bailiang? How disappointing. I wanted to find this sword Dao Senior to spar with him after I returned from the sword pool. Although it's convenient now, I don't know if Li Chungang is worthy of unsheathing the plain sword." Xianyuan Qingfeng smiled and said, "A starving camel is still bigger than a horse. Isn't that old man the 8th? Xianyuan Guiqi smiled indifferently and said, "Girl, don't try to goad me. Do you know that once one's sword Dao realm regresses, the difficulty of advancing again, especially for an expert at Li Chunggang's realm, is comparable to ascension? As long as he's not a first-stage sword immortal, your grandfather can fight him. If this 8th rank is real gold and silver, then that's fine. But if it's only because of Li Chunggang's unparalleled heroic figure that they gave him a title, then I might as well expose this fig leaf. The former sword god without the wooden horse and 1 arm being defeated by the plain embracing sword is better than being used as a stepping stone by those young people." Xianyuan Qingfeng was about to say something when the old man waved his hand and said, "Girl, go first. Don't catch a cold from the wind. That bookish father of yours is going to nag me for a month or so." Xianyuan Qingfeng left the aspiring cauldron pavilion with a gloomy expression. How could one survive in the Xianyuan clan where martial arts fanatics gathered? Xianyuan Qingfeng walked in the pavilion. There were bookshelves on both sides, and her slender hand slowly touched the secret manuals arranged according to the pronunciation of the first word. Her eyes were dull. The ancient books that her fingers touched were all martial arts secret manuals that Jianghu dreamed of. She had read most of them and memorized them in her mind. Because she knew that once she got married, she would no longer be allowed to enter the aspiring cauldron pavilion, even if it was to find a son-in-law. Therefore, she had been painstakingly memorizing the contents of the secret manuals all these years, page after page, book after book, hoping that she could find a man she could rely on in the future to revitalize the first wife's branch whose spirit had been sapped by her scholarly father and restore the glory of a great sect. After walking out of the aspiring cauldron pavilion, Xianyuan Qingfeng's face was filled with determination. An old woman who had taken care of Xianyuan Qingfeng since she was young hurriedly ran over and whispered, "Miss, Yuan Tingshan is back. There are signs of him being seriously injured and dying." Xianyuan Qingfeng calmly asked, "Can he be saved?" The old woman shook her head and said, "Using normal methods, he'll definitely die." Xianyuan Qingfeng stood there in a daze, as if her soul had left her body. The old woman said sympathetically, "Miss, if Yuan Tingshan dies, then so be it. Just find another young man and nurture him with all your heart." Xianyuan Qingfeng's lips turned pale as she murmured, "There's no chance for that." She suddenly turned around and walked past countless bookshelves in the pavilion to the Riverview Terrace. With a plop, she knelt down behind Xianyuan Guiqi. The old man, who had mastered qi cultivation, remained silent and didn't ask anything. Xianyuan Qingfeng put her hands and knees on the bone-chilling green jade floor and said in a low voice, "Grandpa, please save Yuan Tingshan's life." Xianyuan Guiqi said something that others couldn't understand. If you want to have the ability to humiliate others, you must first have the ability to humiliate yourself. Xianyuan Qingfeng's body began to tremble more and more violently. In the end, she lay on the ground, feeling as if a knife was twisting in her heart. She sobbed and said, "Grandpa, why did the great ancestor choose me for dual cultivation? Why? As long as Grandpa can save Yuan Tingshan, as long as Yuan Tingshan can withstand 10 strikes from the great ancestor, Qingfeng won't have to be a bull anymore." Xianyuan Guiqi shook his head. A middle-aged Confucian scholar who resembled Xianyuan Guiqi walked into the Riverview Terrace while coughing. His hair was tied up in a bun, and he held the Forbidden Thunder mantra of virtue in one hand and covered his mouth with the other. After releasing his hand, he put his hand behind his back, leaving behind a pool of blood. Xianyuan Guiqi was slightly angry. "Jingqing, since you're not well, don't walk around." Xianyuan Jingqing said bitterly, "Life and death are predestined. Just accept your fate." Xianyuan Guiqi, who had his back to the father and daughter, waved his sleeve. Clearly, he was quite angry. Xianyuan Jingqing took the Taoist book from his bloody hand and held it tightly. He bent down, freeing his hand to support his daughter. Xianyuan Qingfeng's limbs were already weak, but at this moment, a surge of strength surged up and she threw her father's hand away. She cried and cursed, "You don't deserve it." The eldest grandson of the Xianyuan family, Xianyuan Jingqing, had a bitter expression on his face. He said softly, "Let's go. Your mother has warmed a pot of Angelica wine for you to warm your stomach." Xianyuan Qingfeng stood up shakily and staggered out of the Wangjiang terrace, leaving Xianyuan Jingqing with a resolute and desolate back view. Xianyuan Guiqi was angry at his son's lack of struggle and lamented his misfortune. He raised his voice and reprimanded, "Look at you. Back then, in order to marry a loose woman who could be anyone's wife, you disgraced the family. What have you been doing all these years?" Xianyuan Jingqing said calmly, "Reading. Reading the spring and autumn annals of righteousness. Reading Taoism without action. Reading Buddhism with compassion." Xianyuan Jingqing said word by word, neither warm nor angry. His tone was extremely slow. Indeed, if it wasn't for his gentle temperament, how could he have endured 20 years of supercilious suppression? The other two branches were already riding on top of his head to shit and piss, but this scholar never uttered a word, only reading his book. Jingqing wants to let the ancestor know that his so-called understanding of the three religions is bullsh*. Xianyuan Jingqing walked to the railing and stood side by side with Xianyuan Guiqi. Xianyuan Guiqi was so angry that his eyebrows were twitching. He wanted to slap this good-for-nothing son of his to death. Xianyuan Jingqing smiled. He held the Forbidden Thunder spell of virtue tightly. Blood seeped into the pages. He said, "Since I can't become an immortal Zhenren, shut up. You disgraceful thing." Xianyuan Guiqi slapped his son's face and walked away. Obviously, if this middle-aged scholar was allowed to continue, his words would only shock people to death. Xianyuan Jingqing, who was slapped, was indifferent. He looked at Longhu. Logically speaking, with the strength of Xianyuan Guiqi's hand, even if he restrained it, the slap on Xianyuan Jingqing's face would not disappear in a flash. When there was no one left in the Wending Pavilion, he threw out the Forbidden Thunder spell of virtue and leaped over the railing. He flew out of the Bull Mound and went straight to the surface of the Dragon King River. When he fell in midair, he stepped on the book with the tip of his foot and swept across the sky like an eagle or a falcon. The world's Zhenren was so close that they could not recognize him. Xianyuan Jingqing floated across the Dragon King River. The first time his foot landed on the shore, it created a big pit. The second step was slightly smaller, and the third step was even smaller. He took 7 consecutive steps, each step stepping on the pit like a blooming lotus. A lotus appeared with each step. After 7 steps, the ground was already covered in dust. Chapter 299. Chapter 3. His Royal Highness's talk about fame and fortune is quite insightful. If a scholar fishes for fame and compliments, it may seem easy, but in fact, it's no different from a merchant. A famous scholar's mysterious talk harms the country. This scholar is not a scholar. Holding the scriptures at home, laughing at the frozen bones outside the door. This kind of reading is indeed not reading. It's just reading the impolite, heartless, and unrighteous heavenly book. Mount Hui Xianyuan Jingqing, on behalf of Zhang Xuanping, who is both a teacher and a friend, pays his respects to His Royal Highness. Xianyuan Jingsheng, on behalf of Wang Yangming, a scholar from Xiangfan, pays his respects to the king of Bailiang. Finally, Xianyuan Jingsheng pays his respects to the king of Bailiang on behalf of all the poor scholars in the world. Su Fengnian widened his eyes and looked at the scholar in green who was walking towards him. He didn't know that this guy was eavesdropping just now, and he couldn't detect the flow of his qi at all. When they were 30 steps away, the man who called himself Xianyuan Jingsheng bowed 3 times in a row. After straightening his back, he stopped moving forward. Murong Wuzhu, who was squatting beside His Royal Highness and picking hawthorns, dropped her hawthorns on the ground when she heard the 2 words, Xianyuan. Murong Tongwang was a little calm, but his knuckles were blue, revealing the panic in his heart. For the siblings, the Xianyuan clansmen on the Bull Mound were not the Jianghu individual immortals who enjoyed the good fortune of the land alone, but the devil who played Jianzhou in the palm of his hand. However, Murong Tongwang still fiercely pulled away his sister who was trying to grab Su Fengnian's sleeve. He almost helped her stand up and walked away. It seemed that he didn't want to be implicated, but Su Fengnian and Murong Tongwang's lips almost curled up at the same time after they separated. Obviously, they had a tacit understanding. Since someone from the Xianyuan family had taken the initiative to attack instead of defending, even knowing Su Fengnian's identity, Su Fengnian didn't dare to slack off in the slightest, even if it was the infamous Xianyuan Jingsheng. This person had respectfully bowed 3 times, so there must be something fishy going on. After Su Fengnian stood up, he caught a glimpse of Huang Man, and Qing Niao approaching. They were both in a horn-like position. He smiled and asked, "Mister's 3 bows are enough to shock the heavens and make ghosts weep. I just don't know if Mr. dares to do such a thing on the Bull Mound." Xianyuan Jingsheng said calmly, "If you say I don't dare, His Royal Highness doesn't seem to believe it. If I say I don't dare, His Royal Highness will draw his knife on the spot." Su Fengnian stared at the eldest grandson of the Xianyuan family who had become the laughingstock of the Xianyuan family. He didn't want to be deliberately mystified anymore, so he said impatiently, "Say it, why are you looking for me? If it weren't for your friendship with Mr. Sun, why would I talk nonsense with you?" Xianyuan Jingsheng went straight to the point and said calmly, "Your Highness, do you know why my daughter, Xianyuan Qingfeng, made things difficult for you in Wuzhou?" Su Fengnian clenched the spring thunder in his left hand. He wanted to kill with one blow with the knife in his left hand. "You didn't go to Mount Hui to look for trouble with the Xianyuan family, but dared to come down the mountain to provoke me? When did the Xianyuan family have a scholar who worried about the country and the people?" Su Fengnian exhaled softly, the qi in his body surging like a river. He smiled and said, "Sir, please speak." Xianyuan Jingsheng said calmly, "You look very much like someone. You look like 4 or 5 years old, but your spirit is very similar." Su Fengnian's spring thunder exploded and arrived in front of Xianyuan Jingsheng in an instant. It was born out of Spear Fairy Wang Xiu's famous skill, Overlord Armor Removal. The spring thunder struck down, entering Xianyuan Jingsheng's neck and coming out from his waist. With one successful strike, it was about to cut him in half. Xianyuan Jingsheng frowned. His left foot didn't move, but the tip of his right foot spun, drawing a semicircle on the ground. His left hand held the book behind his back, and his right hand reached out with 2 pale fingers to pinch the spring thunder, following the momentum of Su Fengnian's knife to remove the force. The middle-aged scholar made a sound of surprise and was slightly surprised. The scholar's cuff holding the knife fluttered even though there was no wind. Su Fengnian turned the blade, and Xianyuan Jingsheng let go of his hand and stepped back. The tips of his feet crisscrossed, and his figure was indescribably light and graceful. He continued, "And this person is the man that Qingfeng's mother couldn't let go of. If this man didn't die of illness, she definitely wouldn't have married into Mount Hui. Qingfeng's calligraphy and painting were all learned from her mother. There is a portrait that has been hanging for 20 years. When Qingfeng saw you in the lantern market, it was inevitable that she would lose her composure. I hope your Highness will be magnanimous enough to forgive her." Su Fengnian took large strides forward, and the spring thunder pierced straight at the whale. Xianyuan Jingsheng held the book in his left hand and struck the spring thunder, swatting it away. Su Fengnian's right hand was about to unsheath the embroidered winter sword when Xianyuan Jingqing, who had endured it time and time again, snorted coldly. His figure suddenly moved forward, and he pressed one hand on Su Fengnian's shoulder. With a gentle push, Su Fengnian was forced to turn his body, but he still took the opportunity to pull out the embroidered winter sword. It was the posture of pulling up a mountain. Xianyuan Jingqing sneered. You don't know when to stop. How rude and unreasonable His Royal Highness is. Su Fengnian inexplicably sheathed his sword, and the spring thunder and embroidered winter sword returned to their sheaths. It was because of Huang Man, He smiled and said, last time when I went to the tomb outside Zhejiang City, I saw a few wine cups. Were they all yours, sir? Xianyuan Jingqing nodded dejectedly and asked, why did you sheathe your sword at the last moment? Su Fengnian pointed at Huang Man, who was squatting in the distance and smiled. My little brother knows if others have any ill intentions. Xianyuan Jingqing said with mixed feelings, he was born in the Vajra realm. Su Fengnian was puzzled. Pardon me for asking, but you are obviously a martial arts expert. How did you end up in such a state at Bulgang? Xianyuan Jingqing calmly revealed the earth-shattering truth. Qingfeng's mother and Xianyuan Great Pan were dual cultivating to take revenge on me. Now this old ancestor wants Qingfeng to enter Bulgang again. Xianyuan Jingqing's voice was steady. He did not deliberately lower his voice to cover his ugliness. Murong Tonghuang and Murong Wuzhu looked at each other. Even the thick-skinned Su Fengnian was stunned. He was shocked beyond words. How could there be such a shameless old man who liked to take advantage of the grass around his nest? That was the daughter-in-law of his eldest grandson. In the end, he did not even let go of his great-granddaughter. He would rather kill the wrong person than let go of the wrong person. Compared to this sensational inside story, trying to kidnap the Murong Shuangbi was not worth mentioning. Xianyuan Jingqing said bitterly, this old ancestor did not indulge in beauty. It was because he wanted to achieve the immortal Zhenren realm that he took an unorthodox path. Su Fengnian scolded, Bullsh *t. Whether it is the Dao sex bedroom technique or the esoteric sex dual cultivation, Xianyuan Jingqing, are you still a man? Xianyuan Jingqing said indifferently, I have learned all the secret exercises of Mount Hui's Wending Pavilion in 20 years. I have taken a fork in the road with no return. I am not afraid of death. I only ask for the safety of the mother and daughter. Xianyuan Jingqing said slowly. He coughed a few times and covered his mouth. The blood stains were scarlet. It was a ghastly sight. Su Fengnian could not keep up with the thoughts of this sickly scholar. He asked, can you fight with Xianyuan Great Plate to the death? I heard that this old monster's strength is very strong. The Taoist classics in Xianyuan Jingqing's hands were already stained red. He put them behind his back. He smiled at Su Fengnian and said, I can. He wants to achieve immortality. I will let him experience it. However, the immortal Zhenren realm that I have achieved is not really immortality. Therefore, the outcome is 50-50. However, after I die, what will happen to the mother and daughter? I have been thinking about this problem. That is why I have been waiting for His Royal Highness. Today, I came to see Your Highness. Your first blade was excellent. Not to mention that your bladesmanship is accomplished, your blade is even more ruthless. Xianyuan Jingqing sincerely asks for Your Highness' help. In this world, only Your Highness can save the mother and daughter. Su Fengnian was shocked again. Xianyuan Jingqing continued, once Xianyuan Great Plate dies, only my father Xianyuan Guoqi and my younger brother Xianyuan Jingxian will be troublesome in Mount Hui. If these two die, as long as Your Highness can protect Qingfeng's life, you can use her as a puppet to control the Bull Gang. Su Fengnian asked, is this a trap set by the Xianyuan family? Xianyuan Jingqing shook his head and said, no. Su Fengnian was helpless. He shook his head and said, if it is as you said, it is not difficult for me to do it. However, you must help to get rid of either Xianyuan Guoqi or Xianyuan Jingxian. Otherwise, it will be too difficult for a helpless Xianyuan Qingfeng to swallow an elephant. Xianyuan Jingqing said without hesitation, all right. I will go up the mountain and kill Xianyuan Jingxian first. Su Fengnian was speechless. Was this man completely crazy? Xianyuan Jingxing looked at the navy blue bull gang and murmured, I am here. This mountain man went up the mountain to kill people. Chapter 300. This bull hill that confronted the mansion of Taoist master was really a mixed group of good and bad people. Enjoying the good fortune of the land alone? Su Fengnian sat back on the hillside and wrote a few names on the ground with the spring thunder. He asked Murong Tonghuang, how much do you think Xianyuan Jingxing's words can be trusted? Murong Tonghuang sneered, even if Xianyuan Jingxing really endured the humiliation for 20 years, it's hard to guarantee that this lunatic won't attack His Highness. Killing Xianyuan Dandan and Xianyuan Jingxian, this person will definitely die. But Xianyuan, the Grand Master of Swordsmanship, has been guarding Mount Hui for hundreds of years. How can His Highness's 100 cavalrymen easily suppress him? It's better to let 2 tigers fight than to lure the tiger away. I don't believe that Xianyuan Jingxing, as the legitimate son of Xianyuan's sect, didn't have a few unknown schemes in the past 20 years. Once His Highness dies in the Bull Hill, Bailiang will only vent his anger on Mount Hui. The mother and daughter took advantage of the chaos to enter Jianghu. They are really free birds flying in the sky. If Xianyuan Jingxing is really sincere, kowtowing to His Highness 3 times and exposing his own scandal is nothing. Su Fengnian nodded. It's probably true that Xianyuan Jingxing wants to turn against his family. Su Fengnian sighed, 20 years to achieve immortality through unorthodox methods and overturn hundreds of years of foundation with his own strength. Why does it sound so chilling? Murong Tonghuang had a pair of silkworm eyebrows, but he usually looked more charming than heroic. At this time, he raised his eyebrows and smiled even more gloatingly. The Xianyuan family should have fallen apart and died long ago. Su Fengnian took the hawthorn from Huang Man, and sat cross-legged. He put the hawthorn in his robe and threw one into his mouth. He waved to Murong Tonghuang and said, don't be in a hurry to say angry words. The onlooker sees the situation clearly. You're half an outsider. We're not in a hurry to go up the mountain. You can talk about it casually and see if you can find some clues. No matter how inexplicable it is, in the end, there are only 2 paths, go up the mountain or not. Murong Tonghuang nodded and said, going up the mountain, Your Highness has to take a lot of risks. I'm afraid this is also the original intention of Xianyuan Jingxing to endure until now. He may not be willing to fall out with his family until he has a chance to rely on a strong external force. Otherwise, with Mount Hui's family background, only a land immortal like Qi Xuanjin can come and go like walking on flat ground. Xianyuan Jingxing is obviously not so strong. When the snipe and the clam fight, the mother and daughter will reap the benefits. In fact, it's better if Your Highness doesn't go up the mountain. Or rather, you can go up the mountain slowly and let Xianyuan Jingxing fight with all his strength. I believe that by that time, Hui Mountain's vitality will be greatly damaged. However, if you want to fish in troubled waters at this time, it's far better to take the risk and go up the mountain to hold the line for Xianyuan Jingxing. Su Fengnian always couldn't finish the hawthorn because he almost finished one. Huang Man had already carefully wiped a handful with his sleeve. Su Fengnian wiped the carelessly written words on the ground with spring lightning and threw some hawthorns to the siblings. He said with a smile, go up the mountain, we have to go up the mountain early. Murong Tonghuang frowned and said, why? Su Fengnian stood up and looked at Bull Gang and said softly, to watch a fight. Murong Tonghuang asked carefully and tentatively, Your Highness is addicted to martial arts? Su Fengnian said self-mockingly, I'm just greedy for life and afraid of death. Of course, there are also the thoughts of chivalrous heroes who want to save beauties since childhood. Murong Tonghuang turned his head and couldn't help laughing. The words chivalrous heroes could be said by anyone, but it was said by the eldest son of Ren Tu, who made the whole Jianghu tremble under the sound of horse hooves. It was ridiculous. Su Fengnian said with a smile, laugh if you want. Although Murong Tonghuang had let down some of his guard, he didn't have the guts to be presumptuous in front of His Royal Highness. Of course, he didn't dare to make fun of him. Su Fengnian patted Huang Man's head and said, let's go to Mount Hui. Tear apart whoever blocks the way. Huang Man, Er's originally turbid eyes instantly blossomed with light. Su Fengnian turned to Blue Bird and said, "Go to Xiaoyao Temple and tell the old god of swords and the Phoenix Battalion. You'd better bring the instant spear. We'll meet at Qinglong Creek. This time, we'll play big. By the way, I'll remind the old celestial master Zhao Shituan that Mount Longhu better not get involved. You can explain to the old celestial master that Xianyuan Jingqing invited us to go up the mountain. Let him know that this is a family matter of Mount Hui and not me trying to make trouble for the Xianyuan family." Blue Bird held the bamboo basket and nodded, "Got it." On top of the mud wall of Xiaoyao Temple, old Taoist Zhao stretched his neck and looked at the middle-aged Confucian scholar who was walking on the river. Li Chungang sneered, "This old man really doesn't understand the ways of the world." Back then, heavenly phenomenon aside, a Finger Xian realm cultivator could rank among the top 10 in the world. Now, Finger Xian realm cultivators are as worthless as roadside cabbages. Are they embarrassed to greet people if they're not in the Vajra realm? Zhao Shituan, who had just touched the threshold of the Finger Xian realm, blushed and said, "Old brotherly, you must be joking. These 30 years in the Jianghu are indeed different from the previous 30 years. There are many geniuses and freaks, but there aren't as many Vajras as dogs. His Royal Highness going out to travel is naturally different from ordinary people roaming the Jianghu. If Su Fengnian wasn't the son of the king of Bailiang and his Royal Highness could be hereditary, how could he have met Wu Luding who blocked the river? How could he have met the 11th Wang Mingyin? Even more so, he wouldn't have been humiliated by Xianyuan Jingqing who had just arrived at Mount Longhu. It's not that the Jianghu is changing too quickly, but that old brotherly is following this brat who's too eye-catching. How could a Jianghu person without any ability dare to humiliate himself in front of the heir of Bailiang? Let's not talk about old brotherly, these 100 elite Phoenix Battalion are enough to make a big pot of water. Small fishes and shrimps would have been slapped to death long ago." Li Chungang snorted and said, "What's up with this Xianyuan Jingqing who floated down the bull mound? What's up with your so-called immortal Zhenren realm?" The old celestial master stroked his beard and squinted his eyes. "This young man has a tough life. He's very talented, but as the eldest grandson of the Xianyuan family, he chose not to walk the path of martial arts. When he went down the mountain to take the imperial examinations, he fell in love with a Jianghu woman who didn't know how to repay kindness. That woman didn't come from a good background, but she was stubborn. She probably didn't want to be brought up to Mount Huishan. Xianyuan Pan saw the opportunity and used both the carrot and the stick to dual cultivation. As for whether Xianyuan Pan had the intention to force his grandson to practice martial arts, only God knows. In the past 20 to 30 years, Xianyuan Pan had devoted himself to cultivating the joyful Zen and the art of sex. He had no taboos at all. A few yellow crowns from Mount Longhu had been killed by him. However, those Taoist nuns were also strange. After the incident, they did not say a word. Instead, they took the initiative to be cauldrons at Yuniazhang's side. Xianyuan Pan's ability to control people was impressive. This old bastard was already popular with women when he was young. I heard that in the past 2 years, he took a fancy to Xianyuan Jingqing's daughter, Xianyuan Qingfeng. I guess this time he finally crossed Xianyuan Jingqing's bottom line and no longer swallowed it. However, I'm not sure how Xianyuan Jingqing became an immortal Zhenren. I only know that this kid has been borrowing books from the Celestial Master residence for the past 20 years. He's always been on good terms with my arrogant nephew, Zhao Danping. How strange, I'll have to ask Zhao Danping later." The old god of swords sneered, looking at his ocean of qi. "It's the reverse path of seeking death. It's not worth mentioning." The old celestial master said regretfully, "If this kid wasn't so eager for success, the land of bliss on the stone tablet would be worthy of its name." The old god of swords spat and said, "If he didn't seek death and used his life to exchange for the realm, would he just watch his daughter enter the mouth of that old bastard Xianyuan Pan?" Zhao Shituan put his hands in his sleeves and sighed continuously. He frowned and said, "Brotherly, do you think His Royal Highness will take over this hot potato?" Li Chungang said without hesitation, "Nonsense, it's at least a battle of Xian Finger against Xian Finger. It might even be the peak battle of celestial phenomenon. Would that kid not go? Zhao Shituan still sighed and said, if that's the case, Jiangdong Xianyuan will really be unable to recover for at least 30 years. Li Chungang sneered and said, Xianyuan and Sword Pool are already a few levels lower than the Wu family's sword tomb. Back then, the Wu family's sword master came out and defeated 10,000 riders with 9 swords. That's true glory. Xianyuan and Sword Pool are nothing. Can they stand shoulder to shoulder with the Wu family's sword tomb? It's all the flattery of those bastards in the Jianghu. Seeing Blue Bird carrying a bamboo basket of hawthorns towards Xiaoyao Temple, the old god of swords asked, are you going to Mount Wishan later? The old celestial master laughed bitterly and said, I'm not feeling well. Li Chungang floated down the wall and said disdainfully, old woman, you still have such matters? Zhao Shituan stared but didn't dare to refute. Li Chungang added insult to injury and said, aren't you afraid that your disciple will be at a disadvantage? The old celestial master suddenly became spirited and said happily, my disciple won't be at a disadvantage. It's not that I'm boasting, but the number of people who can hurt Huang Manor can be counted on one hand. But if you want to kill my disciple, there might be 1 or 2 in Mount Longhu, but there aren't any in Mount Wishan. Next should be a small climax. Chapter 301. The buildings on the Bull Mound were very particular, with a strict hierarchy and complicated rules. For example, the rear courtyard where the eldest branch lived was small, but it had everything. There was also a banquet hall, vermilion lacquer, carved red sandalwood, and flying beasts. A large plaque hung on the wall with the words, Heavenly Eternal Winter. There was a courtyard in front and a garden in the back. The east and west wings had a building above them, and there was a large glazed vat half the height of a person in the courtyard. It could hold several thousand caddies of water, and there were 8 or 9 lotus flowers planted there. They were slender and elegant, their roots visible, and a dozen or so fat red carps leisurely swam inside. It was early autumn, and yellow leaves covered the bluestone tiles under the eaves between the red walls and green tiles. No one cleaned the place, so it was cold and cheerless. A woman in a gorgeous palace dress stood in front of the glazed fish vat, holding a small porcelain bowl. She tossed bait into the vat, attracting red carps to swim happily. Her posture was graceful, and her expression was languid. A tall and sturdy man in gorgeous clothes walked straight into the courtyard. A maidservant beside the woman hurriedly lowered her head, not daring to look at him. The middle-aged man's hands were on the edge of his onyx belt, and he habitually gave off an arrogant feeling. Even though he should be calling the woman sister-in-law in this courtyard, he still refused to restrain his arrogance. He raised a hand and waved, driving away the maidservant who was staring at her feet. It was unknown how this submissive maidservant saw the man waving his hand, but she ran toward the door as if she had been pardoned. When she passed by the man, she was fiercely slapped on the buttocks, causing her to pale in fright. The woman with a cold expression was indifferent to this and continued to feed the carps. The middle-aged man walked in front of the glazed vat and extended 2 fingers to stroke the smooth walls of the vat. He smiled and said, Sister-in-law, we're a single man and woman, aren't we doing anything? The woman stared at the carefree red carps and coldly said, Xianyuan Jingxian, aren't you afraid that if you swallow my dumplings, you'll burn your tongue along with your heart, liver, spleen, and kidneys? The man who was called by his name by the woman said indifferently, Sister-in-law lives in seclusion, so of course you don't know. After the ancestor came out of seclusion this time, he intends to entrust the position of the family head to me. It's no wonder that sister-in-law doesn't know about this. Sister-in-law and the ancestor haven't dual cultivated for some time, right? The man placed his palm on the colored glass fish tank and abruptly exerted his strength. More than a dozen carps and lotus roots were pulled to the side of the tank and stuck to it, unable to move. He bent down to look at the carps that were struggling on their deathbed and smiled. Xianyuan Jingxian has been drooling over sister-in-law for a long time. This is something that everyone in Mount Wi knows. Once I officially take over this large bull's nest, how could the old ancestor care about an old and worn-out cauldron? That bookworm big brother of mine worships you like a fairy, thinking that you're above the common populace, but he clearly doesn't understand a woman's thoughts at all. He's wasted all those sage books he's read. A woman in her 30s is like a wolf and in her 40s is like a tiger. Once she's tasted the sweet rain after a long drought, how could she endure loneliness? Isn't that right, sister-in-law? The woman was humiliated in such a way, but she remained unmoved. She only looked at the carps that were almost suffocating to death and indifferently mocked, "Xianyuan Jingxian, what are you so impatient for? It won't be too late to vent your frustrations when you become the head of the Xianyuan family." That's right, do you remember when you went to southern borders 6 years ago? Sister-in-law just happened to see that loyal and unswerving wife of yours on the large bull's bed, but she was extremely seductive. When she first came to Mount Hui, she called me a depraved slut every day. Haven't you wondered why she shut up these past few years? I might as well make it clear to you, it was sister-in-law who pitied her for being lonely, so rather than wasting energy scolding others, she might as well save her energy to serve others in bed. Sister-in-law was so merciful that she earnestly asked old ancestor to shower her with rain and dew. Xianyuan Jingshuan's expression darkened and he paused for a moment. His palm left the wall of the glazed fish tank and the lotus flowers all snapped. Blood seeped out from the scales of the dozen or so carps, and their corpses floated to the surface. Xianyuan Jingxian said the word "good" 3 times in a row, then grinned maliciously. "Xianyuan Jingxing, this big brother, can't do anything even after being beaten 3 times with a stick. I didn't expect sister-in-law to be so scheming, knowing how to use small tricks to retaliate. This is for the best. Today, I'll carry sister-in-law back. I want to see if there's anyone in the eldest branch who can be as unyielding as sister-in-law. Or perhaps Xianyuan Jingxing will simply wantonly have fun with sister-in-law here? I heard that sister-in-law fell ill from longing for a portrait, so I don't mind hanging that portrait at the head of your bed to liven things up. Sister-in-law, what do you think? Isn't Jingxian much more amorous than Big Brother?" The woman calmly gazed at the blood-soaked fish tank and smiled. "Compared to Xianyuan Jingxing, you think too highly of him." Xianyuan Jingxian asked, "Sister-in-law, when you're in bed later, you'll have to use all your skills. A woman's 18 types of martial arts." Xianyuan Jingxian, "You're worse than an animal." An angry roar came from the door. When Xianyuan Jingxian heard the familiar voice, he couldn't be bothered to turn around. He laughed indulgently and said, "Qingfeng, I heard that the bastard surnamed Yuan you thought so highly of is already half dead, so your mother's fate today will be your fate in a few years. Uncle has the patience to wait for that day. Uncle might even wonder if Qingfeng already has a young daughter by the time he reaches 60 years of age. In the past, I didn't understand the meaning of the words enjoying the blessings of the land alone, on the stone tablet, but now I understand that this kind of blessings is truly something that only immortals can enjoy." Xianyuan Qingfeng stood at the door, his fingernails digging into his palms. When she saw her daughter, a trace of panic finally flashed through the woman's eyes. She coldly said, "Qingfeng, leave this place." Xianyuan Jingxian clicked his tongue and laughed. What a touching mother-daughter relationship. Chapter 302. A series of untimely coughs could be heard. Xianyuan Jingxian was stunned and slowly turned around. When he saw a figure appear in the doorway, he was subconsciously startled, but he was immediately amused by his own panic. He stood next to the large glazed vat and unbridled guffawed. The reason why he was surprised was because Xianyuan Jingxian knew that anyone could set foot in this large sect's inner court except for the man at the doorway. And that man just so happened to be the husband of the woman behind Xianyuan Jingxian. How absurd was this? Back then, his wife in her prime would rather dual cultivate with the old ancestor, causing the eldest son of the first wife to become a laughingstock. She would rather stare blankly at a yellowed portrait for 20 years than look directly at her husband. No one would believe it even if he told them. Xianyuan Jingxian, who was on the verge of tears from laughing, wiped the corners of his eyes with a sinister expression. He remembered the warm scene of the 3 brothers standing on the Aspiration Cauldron Pavilion's river-gazing platform when they were children, standing on their tiptoes and leaning against the railing. He clearly remembered that his eldest brother said that he wanted to be a civil official whose name would go down in history. his second brother said that he wanted to revive the family's prestige and surpass the Wu family's sword tomb, and Xianyuan Jingxian declared that he wanted to be a martial artist like Wang Xianji who could smash the enlightened masters of Longhu into meat patties with a single punch. The three brothers were still as close as brothers at that time, but after they grew up, the three of them had completely different futures. Second brother Xianyuan Jingyi had the demeanor of a great general and was clever in all aspects, absorbing many forces in Jianghu that could not be underestimated. Xianyuan Jingxian himself had made great strides on the martial path and was now on the verge of stepping into the Grandmaster realm. His future achievements would only be greater than his father's. But as for his eldest brother, despite the great expectations and resources the old ancestor had bestowed upon him, he was still a useless piece of trash who could only be submissive when speaking to others and would only retreat when arguing with others. In the Xianyuan family, where martial arts were highly valued, how could a martial arts fanatic like Xianyuan Jingxian respect an older brother who had never touched a sword or a staff and only knew how to hold a few books? After coughing, the middle-aged scholar still did not enter the courtyard. He covered his mouth and said vaguely, "Jingxian, you should have waited a little longer. Unfortunately, you've never had much patience since you were young. This is not good." Xianyuan Jingxian seemed to have heard the funniest joke in the world. He had just stopped laughing when he couldn't help but laugh again. He placed his hands on his agate belt and looked straight at his sickly older brother, Xianyuan Jingcheng. "Eldest brother, what do you think I should have waited? Should I have waited for you to become the head of the family with your righteousness and morals? Should I have waited for my niece to become a pitiful cauldron furnace, or should I have waited for my father's to run out again?" Jingshuan's SS father, Jingshuan's father, but eldest, SSS, use, my eldest, even my s. Is, tus. Xianyuan Jingxing loosened his grip and nodded, "Go on." Xianyuan Jingxian chuckled. "I've endured it for many years and I really don't want to endure it any longer, s. 2. Xianyuan Qingfeng's expression changed drastically. The pale-faced scholar slowly said, "But you know that this kind of excessive enthusiasm is like a tree without roots. It has no long-term benefits to the martial path." Xianyuan Jingxian rubbed his stomach and sneered. "You sure are sincere when you say these words. It enlightens me. My stomach hurts from laughing." Xianyuan Jingxing turned to look in the direction of Bull Landing and murmured, "Mount Hui will only be cleaner when it snows heavily in winter. Our family is really too dirty." Xianyuan Qingfeng extended his hand and motioned for his mother to leave the courtyard and stay away from his uncle who had reached the finger-profound realm. But the woman did not move. She would never approach that man of her own accord. The middle-aged scholar stared deeply at her and smiled faintly. There was an indescribable sense of open-mindedness and relief. He, who had never set foot in this courtyard, actually walked over the threshold for the first time. She and Xianyuan Qingfeng were both dazed. Xianyuan Jingxian still had a disapproving and arrogant expression. He sneered, "Big brother, what? Are you going to beat me with a book?" Xianyuan Jingxing shook his head. "Mount Hui cannot be built without destruction. Xianyuan Great Pan has already led Mount Hui down a fork in the road. Today, I will turn it back on the right path. In terms of martial talent, you and Xianyuan Jingxing cannot compare to me. You are the finger-profound realm, so I will kill you with the finger-profound realm." The middle-aged scholar spoke unhurriedly. The sleeves of his wide green robe fluttered elegantly. The mother and daughter only saw this man who had stood aloof from worldly affairs his entire life walk straight toward Xianyuan Jingxian. He seemed to be walking slowly, but he arrived in front of Xianyuan Jingxian in the blink of an eye. Xianyuan Jingxian, who was clearly already at the finger-profound realm, widened his eyes. The middle-aged scholar grabbed him by the neck with one hand and continued walking. They passed through the large glazed vat and arrived at the rear courtyard. The scholar stopped and threw Xianyuan Jingxian into the room. His body exploded in midair. The middle-aged scholar, who was bleeding slightly from his 7 orifices, turned around. He seemed to want to reach out and touch his wife, but in the end, he did not have the courage. When he passed by his daughter at the entrance of the courtyard, he said softly, "Qingfeng, from now on, you will take care of your mother." The woman suddenly shouted, Xianyuan Jingxing, where are you going? The middle-aged scholar continued walking and smiled warmly. To Bull's Descent Snow Field. After sweeping this house clean, you will be truly free. The saints said that if you do not sweep a house, how can you sweep the world? Unfortunately, Xianyuan Jingxing can only reach this step in this lifetime. Xianyuan Jingxing does not regret marrying you back then. Chapter 303. Dead. Inside the room, Xianyuan Jingxian couldn't be any more dead. Even the legendary Earth Immortals wouldn't be able to survive if their sea of qi exploded and all their meridians exploded. Outside the room, the woman stared blankly at the shattered glass vat. More than a dozen red carps were hidden among the green leaves of the lotus flowers. Just now, the two of them had passed through the vat in an instant, causing thousands of pounds of water to pour out and wet her embroidered silk shoes. What a cool autumn day. The autumn wind and autumn chill spread from the soles of her feet to her entire body. Xianyuan Qingfeng leaned weakly against the door. Even though she had always been praised by her elders for being able to remain calm during major events, she had lost the ability to think. Her mind was blank. No matter how immoral her uncle, Xianyuan Jingxian, was, after all, a genuine top-notch martial artist. He had cultivated a Vajra physique for several decades by following the prescribed order. In Mount Hui, he was publicly recognized as second only to the great ancestor and Xianyuan Guiqi, who possessed immortal qi. He had even claimed to have entered the mysterious Finger Xian realm. So what if he had just entered the Finger Xian realm and his foundation was still unstable? Only after reaching the Finger Xian realm could one truly become a towering tree that stood tall in the martial arts world. Taoist enlightened masters had hopes of ascending, living Buddhas of Buddhism could become Sariras, and unaffiliated martial artists outside of the three religions were even more ferocious and domineering. How did he die in the blink of an eye? Xianyuan Qingfeng was limited by her mediocre talent and constitution, so she wasn't suitable for martial arts. However, she had read many secret manuals since she was a child and was used to seeing experts fight. She especially had a photographic memory, so her eyes were very sharp. She could see that after Xianyuan Jingxian lost focus for a moment, he actually wanted to kill his opponent very quickly. However, his opponent didn't give him the chance at all. There was probably no way to die in peace more than this. As a Finger Xian expert, he was casually walked up to him and killed in a single move. In that instant, Xianyuan Qingfeng saw through some secrets. Xianyuan Jingxuan's body was like that of a Buddhist heavenly king's Vajra. Although he was still 2 levels away from the celestial phenomenon realm, where both the inside and outside of his body were in harmony with the world, at the very least, his body had already formed a majestic image of its own. The reason why it was shattered with a single strike seemed to be because after being grabbed by the neck, Xianyuan Jingxian had used a tyrannical and vicious method to guide the flow of qi. It was like the tortoise and serpent of the northern black tortoise entangling with each other, which ultimately caused his meridians to explode inch by inch. Xianyuan Qingfeng wanted to say something, but hesitated. His lips trembled as he realized that he didn't know what to say. When she saw that her mother was about to turn around and enter the house, she finally gathered her courage and asked, "Mother, are we really not going to Bull's Descent Snow Field?" The woman turned her head and asked, "Are we going to see how Xianyuan Jingxing seeks death?" Xianyuan Qingfeng muttered to himself, since father was able to kill Xianyuan Jingxian, it's not impossible for him to. She stepped over the threshold and didn't even look at the badly mutilated corpse. She smiled and said, "So what? If Xianyuan Jingxing is not the Xianyuan Jingxing that we mother and son know, I will regret it so much that my intestines turn green, and I will cry like a weeping beauty to beg him to change his mind. Afterwards, we will treat each other with respect and grow old together at Mount Hui." Tears streamed down Xianyuan Qingfeng's face. "Mother, you really don't feel the slightest bit of heartache?" She smiled and said, I have long since forgotten the feeling of heartache. If you want to go, then go to Snow Field. Mother wants to be alone for a while." An old mama who had watched Xianyuan Qingfeng grow up hurriedly rushed over and respectfully reported, "Madam, miss, for some reason, Lord has gone to Snow Field alone." At the foot of the mountain, someone claimed that Lord had invited him to Bull's Descent Snow Field as a guest. It seems to be that domineering heir of Baelyang. He has already begun to climb the mountain and will soon arrive at Sect. Those who blocked the way at the estate were all torn apart by an unremarkable youth. His methods were extremely swift and fierce. Rumor has it that the divine swordsman Li Chungang who humiliated our Xianyuan family in the past was also among them. Second Master has already brought people to stop them. After climbing the Bull's Descent snow field, there was a jade passageway paved with 300 steps, and a memorial arch built across the road. This was Mount Hui's Xianyuan Sexy Sect. The words, "Reach the Peak of Perfection," were written on the plaque, and the words, "Martial Dao Contract Kunlun," were written on it. Their neighbor, Mount Longhu, also had a similar structure. All civil and military officials had to dismount from their horses in front of the tablet to demonstrate the reverence of the ancestral court of Taoism. When it came to Mount Hui, it was a reminder to all the Jianghu people who came to visit to voluntarily remove their swords and sabers. It wasn't that there weren't arrogant and boorish martial artists who didn't want to follow the rules, but those who succeeded like Li Chungang could be counted on one's fingers. The vast majority of them were thrown off the Bull's Descent snow field. The sallow and emaciated Su Longxiang was in a killing frenzy. He was simply invincible. Chapter 304. One must know that Mount Hui was said to be home to nearly 1,000 martial arts elites. The Xianyuan family dominated the southeast and could be divided into several types of people. The first type was the direct descendants of the family who were born with the surname Xianyuan. This branch was led by the third branch of the Mount Hui family. Under the head of the family, Xianyuan Guiqi, there were Xianyuan Jingxian and Xianyuan Jingxian supporting the family. Together, they formed the most luxuriant martial arts tree in the southeast of the dynasty. These people had the innate advantage of being close to the family. Based on their bloodline and talent in martial arts, they could go to the Wending Pavilion to obtain secret manuals. Then there were the lackeys that Xianyuan had raised with both secret manuals and a lot of money. There were two kinds of lackeys. Those who were of noble status were guests and enjoyed good treatment in Mount Huishan. Those who came from humble backgrounds and were not strong enough had to work hard for the Xianyuan family with their tails between their legs in order to earn a living. If Yuan Tingshan did not have a relationship with Xianyuan Qingfeng, he would belong to this camp and had to rely on his own ability to get what he wanted. Then there were the private forces that Xianyuan had carefully cultivated. There were two main forces. One was made up of 200 cavalrymen and 50 heavy cavalrymen who had spent a lot of money. The other was made up of 150 light cavalrymen who were relatively cheaper. The other group was made up of loyal men of sacrifice. Their identities were complicated. Some of them were warriors or rangers who had fled to Hui Mountain to seek refuge. Most of them were assassins who had been slowly cultivated by Xianyuan as pawns since they were young. Very few of them could live to 30 years of age, which showed how active the Xianyuan family was in the southeast Jianghu. His Royal Highness and Huang Manor stood together under the Gate. Beside them stood the old man with the sheepskin fur coat. Blue Bird held the instant spear. Behind them were the halberd Ningame and 100 white horses. Near the two gates were a crowd of people. Sabers, spears, staffs, and all kinds of weapons were present. Xianyuan Jingxian stood on the steps with a gloomy expression. Close to 100 archers with outstanding arm strength held the geographical advantage, ready to shoot. More than 30 guests had turned out in full force. They were all experts who had been famous in the Jianghu for a long time. Su Fengnian clicked his tongue and sighed. What a turbulent Jianghu. Dark clouds had already gathered overhead, and there was actually a sign of heavy rain. A few decades later, Old Man Li, who was now one-armed and without a sword, dozed off while standing. He did not say a word. Su Fengnian turned his head and asked, "How far is it from here to the thieves' lair?" The elderly god of swords opened his eyes slightly and said lazily, "It's not too far." Outside of Bull Landing, there was a large piece of flat land, which was the snow plateau. If I'm not mistaken, Xianyuan Jingxing will have a fight with Xianyuan Pan there. It is indeed a good place for people to die. Su Fengnian felt a headache coming on. There are so many first and second-rate experts and a few hundred men of sacrifice. How are we going to get past them? Li Chungang grumpily said, "This old man can easily pass through by himself. As for you, if you want to fight force with force, then you'll have to wait to die here. Do you think that the foundation of a large clan that has been established for hundreds of years is just for show?" Su Fengnian whispered, "To catch bandits, first catch the ringleader." The elderly god of swords thought for a while and said, "You mean to take down Xianyuan Jingqing?" Su Fengnian smiled and nodded, eager to give it a try. The elderly god of swords rubbed his chin and narrowed his eyes. If this old man were to personally take action, it would be simple. However, without this old man's effort, you'll just sit back and watch the show. Kid, let Huang Man yell first to show your strength and tear a few people apart before talking about anything else. Then, let this girl beside you, who can play anything but the instant spear, hold the fort. When this old man will take action, it will depend on his mood. Don't worry, I won't make you wait too long. This old man was also very curious about how high Xianyuan Jingqing could reach if he did not hesitate to exchange his life for his realm. It was not too rare for heavenly phenomenon experts to fight each other, but it would be interesting if both of them were trapped in a situation where they would fight to the death. If half a land immortal accidentally popped out, it would be a feast for the eyes. Kid, you don't have any other abilities, but you're just so at stealing from others. Looking at Huang Man, taking large strides forward, the elderly god of swords said with slight sadness, "This old man's painstaking efforts back then have been wasted." Xianyuan Jingqing finally appeared after much difficulty, yet he still rebelled. This big tree has been hollowed out in the hands of Xianyuan Jingqing. In the end, it is still going to fall. Great Snow Plateau. The middle-aged scholar walked slowly against the wind. His sleeves fluttered in the wind, making him stand out from the crowd. After enduring silently for 20 years, he finally revealed his loftiness at this moment. Along the way, he kept coughing and blood seeped out. No one could see through him. Xianyuan Jingqing thought of many things, good and bad, honor and disgrace, ups and downs. Xianyuan Jingqing stopped and looked at the tall figure at the end of the Great Snow Plateau. He muttered, "I've finally reached here." That figure was abnormally tall and sturdy. This was an old man with a technique to retain his youthful appearance. The old man who had a head full of white hair 20 years ago actually had black hair at his temples. He stood at the entrance of Bull Descendant's mansion without a smile. One man guarding the pass with a majestic aura. This old ancestor, the only one on Mount Hui who had the qualifications to say that he enjoyed the land's blessings alone, had a sharp gaze and a loud voice. "Jingqing, have you ever read To Resonate with Heaven and Earth?" His deep voice surged in the Great Snow Plateau. There was a string of wind chimes hanging under the eaves of Bull Descendant's house. Because of the strong wind at the peak of the mountain, they jingled all year round. At this moment, it was silent. Like a person who was about to die with his neck strangled. Xianyuan Jingqing said calmly, "Whether it is a celestial phenomenon or not, we'll know after we try." The old man who had been in charge of the Xianyuan family for 60 years was able to return to his original state after nearly 20 years. He laughed heartily and said, "I'd like to see if this unfilial descendant of yours can endure 100 moves." Xianyuan Jingqing, who no longer needed to painstakingly suppress his realm, raised his hand. He stepped out with his right foot and bent his left foot slightly. He stretched out one hand and pulled back the other. It was too wonderful for words. In an instant, the dark clouds in the sky spun like a tornado and suddenly descended. Xianyuan Jingqing said softly, "I shake Kunlun." Chapter 305. If Xianyuan Jingxian was said to be an unsheathed sword, then Xianyuan Jingjing was a blunt saber. Although it was not as sharp, it was more useful to the clan. Xianyuan Jingshuan's temperament was not suited to dealing with people. That eldest grandson of his, who was always elusive, only knew how to study, so many heavy responsibilities naturally fell on Xianyuan Jingjing's shoulders. He welcomed guests from all over the world and was adept at nurturing soldiers. The second branch's position had risen over the years, becoming more and more stable. Out of 10 guest officials, Xianyuan Jingxian was in charge of 200 cavalry. When the heroes of the nearby provinces mentioned him, they would all raise their thumbs and praise him for being a timely rain from Jiangdong. There was once a beautiful servant who made fun of a lame martial artist who came up the mountain out of admiration. The latter descended the mountain in shame and indignation. When Xianyuan Jingxian heard this, he immediately cut off the head of his favored servant and carried it down the mountain to beg for forgiveness. At that time, this martial artist was just a nobody in Jianghu, but now he was a guest official of Mount Hui. The generation with the surname Jing was divided into 3 branches, and the distribution of resources was always going to be uneven, so there was no such thing as keeping pace. The eldest grandson, Xianyuan Jingsheng, was already recognized as a withered tree with sparse branches and leaves, without any shade to speak of. Xianyuan Jingxian was too domineering, even daring to say that he would eat dumplings and eat sisters-in-law. Coupled with his self-confidence in his grandmaster realm, it was hard to avoid suspicion that he was 1,000 miles away from others. Did Xianyuan Jingjing have any thoughts of moving into Yunia town in the future? Now that he was riding a tiger, it was hard to get off. He himself did not want to, but with everyone propping him up on the bonfire, it seemed that he had no choice but to fight for it. In the family, there were only free and unfettered dogs, but no free and unfettered people. His eldest brother, Xianyuan Jingsheng, had already given him the desolate fate of not fighting for it. Xianyuan Jingshuan's appearance was dignified, and when he was young, he was known as an elegant young master of Jiangdong. However, his temperament was honest, and his sharpness was restrained, so it was very easy for people to feel close to him. At this moment, Xianyuan Jingxian had a headache as he faced off against those uninvited Bailiang barbarians, but he wasn't afraid. He had more than 100 archers by his side, and their arm strength was undoubtedly much better than that of ordinary soldiers. A volley of arrows rained down like water. What's more, the guests of Mount Huishan had heard that it was Ren Tu's son who had ascended the mountain. They were united against a common enemy. Even those from third brother's side had rushed over after hearing the news. In Xianyuan Jingzong's opinion, if the other side did not have the support of the old divine swordsman Li Chungang, it would be like using a butcher's knife to kill a chicken. Li Chungang was single-handedly wielding a spear and riding a horse. No matter how old he was, how could the 30 guests not be able to surround him? However, there were many things in this world that could not be explained by ordinary reasoning. In a chess game that he was certain to win, Xianyuan Jingxian did not dare to be too presumptuous. If he really got carried away and accidentally slaughtered that Bailiang heir, what good would that do for Mount Hui? Xianyuan Jingxian gazed at His Royal Highness under the Yi sect. There was a great disparity in numbers between the two sides. Since victory was already in his grasp, he only needed to control the strength of his blows. Xianyuan Jingshuan's thoughts drifted. He was confident that his martial arts talent was not inferior to his younger brothers, but these past few years, his father, Xianyuan Jingxian, had devoted most of his time to the sword. Most of the year, he was either in seclusion or exploring secluded places in search of otherworldly experts to sharpen his swordsmanship. Xianyuan Jingxian poured his heart and soul into managing an aristocratic family, so it was inevitable that his martial arts cultivation would be delayed. In his youth, his eldest brother, Xianyuan Jingxian, had not touched martial arts other than a few techniques to strengthen his body. Xianyuan Jingxian and Xianyuan Jingxian were equally matched when it came to martial arts. After reaching the age of 30, Xianyuan Jingxian had even surpassed him. After reaching the no-doubt state, he had to worry about the trivial matters of the family, and it was only then that his third brother, Xianyuan Jingxian, gradually began to leave. How could Xianyuan Jingxian not hate his eldest brother? If it wasn't for the fact that Xianyuan Jingxing was unwilling to learn martial arts and take up the heavy responsibility. Thinking of this, Xianyuan Jingxing couldn't help but laugh at himself in his heart. 10 years ago, he was still secretly grateful to Big Brother Ling for not fighting for power. It was only later that he realized that the glamorous position that seemed to be in his hands was neither enticing nor reliable. The guests on the Bull Mound were divided into 3 distinct groups. Those who had clearly joined Xianyuan Jingsheng and Xianyuan Jingshuan's camps were split into 2 groups. The rest were still undecided. The situation of who the next family head would fall into was still unclear. This group of Jianghu bigwigs clearly decided that they wouldn't act unless they saw a rabbit. Birds of a feather flocked together. The guests of Mount Hui besides Xianyuan Jingxing all had relatively gentle personalities. They all had good reputations in Jianghu. They belonged to the type of heroes who eliminated evil and eliminated evil. Each of them was awe-inspiring righteous. When they saw His Royal Highness and his group walking up the mountain, they all showed expressions of righteous indignation. On the other hand, Xianyuan Jingshuan's group was the complete opposite. Most of them were fugitives who had fled into the mountains in search of protection, and they were all infamous for their ferocity. Among them, there were a few bandits who were among the best in the southeastern region of the dynasty, and there was also a notorious flower picker. The last group was both good and evil. They didn't adhere to morals. They were called the martial loose men by the orthodox people in the imperial court who had a good impression of Jianghu. These people usually didn't do great evil. When they felt like it, they would do some good deeds. Over time, they had accumulated some reputation. At this time, the two guests' gazes met and then immediately looked away, as if they were disgusted. Xianyuan Jingxian inwardly smiled. This was the result of his deliberate management. The number of guests in Mount Hui was astonishing, and most of them were quite strong. Even those who were mediocre in martial arts had some strange skills. However, Mount Hui spent a lot of money to give these guests a comfortable and luxurious life. If they wanted women, they gave them women. If they wanted secret manuals, they gave them secret manuals. But the important figures of Mount Hui had a clear account book in their bellies. There were only 7 or 8 people who really caught the eye of Buldagang. Among these people, the chief guest Huang Fangfua and the second guest Hong Yu were the most worthy to be accepted. Hong Yu was the lame son of a nameless soldier. This person didn't disappoint Xianyuan Jingshuan's expectations. In Mount Hui blessed land, where geniuses were everywhere, his martial arts talent didn't lose to Xianyuan Jingshuan's. His cultivation improved by leaps and bounds. Because of Hong Yu's heroic character and heroic spirit, he was the most popular among the guests. Not only that, Hong Yu was also proficient in the art of war. After he was given the power to command the cavalry, he helped the entire second branch, which allowed the second branch to suppress the third branch. He could be said to be Xianyuan Jingshuan's lucky general. The chief guest of Mount Hui, Huang Fangfua, was the #1 martial artist in Jianghu. He was close to the realm of Grandmaster. When he encountered a big bottleneck in martial arts, he came to Mount Hui just to borrow secret manuals. Under normal circumstances, Buldagang wouldn't ask Huang Fangfua to do anything. After all, guests weren't like the lackeys of the family who came and went as they pleased. These experts mostly followed the rules of guests who stayed and left if they didn't. Moreover, the most difficult people to serve in the world were the literati and experts. The originally arrogant and domineering Mount Hui was cultivated under Xianyuan Jingxian. For more than 10 years, they had been pursuing harmony and wealth. They didn't want to bully their customers. This unknowingly increased the status and arrogance of the guests, and their tempers became more and more crafty. How many people could be like Xianyuan Jingxian, who killed a concubine in order to win people's hearts? Huang Fangfua was also a very smart person. He was proficient in all kinds of martial arts. He had reached a higher level early and rarely met a worthy opponent in Jianghu. However, he was suppressed under the realm of Grandmaster. He couldn't understand why. During this period, he risked his life to go to the western regions and Beimang. However, he still couldn't reach the realm that seemed to be within reach. Finally, on the Spring God Lake, he had a sword discussion with Xianyuan Jingqi. They appreciated each other's talent and were invited to Mount Hui. Now, Huang Fangfua was the leader of the martial artists. He only treated Xianyuan Jingxian and Xianyuan Jingxian with respect, but didn't see each other with sincerity. Instead, he often drank wine and talked about history with the useless guy of the eldest branch. A big clan that was committed to dominating Jianghu naturally had its own petty interests. However, it also had a grand plan to look at the entire Jianghu. Huang Manor walked to the open space in the middle of the square with his bare hands. Xianyuan Jingqi had already received the news that this skinny young man had killed more than 10 people on his way up the mountain. Their hands and feet were all torn apart while they were still alive. Xianyuan Jingxi was the flag of Mount Hui when his ancestor and father weren't present. He lived like a prince in a high position. He cared about his face the most. He wanted to show his royal highness who was in his power. He coldly said, "Release the arrows." The bowstring released an ear-piercing buzzing sound. The arrows flew like locusts towards the young man who didn't know whether he was dead or alive. The first great initial realm of Vajra was derived from the teachings of Buddhism. It meant that the Buddha's body was immortal. The Vajra Dharma body was known as the strongest body in the three realms. Immortal Lu Dongxian once wrote a crooked poem, having obtained the three pure immortality technique, having obtained the Vajra Dharma body. He said that this poem was crooked because it mixed up Buddhism and Taoism. However, the younger generation didn't dare to look down on it. Thus, the Vajra realm was seen as the minor immortality realm in Taoism. It was to show the difference between great immortality and great immortality. Most of the pre-celestial cultivators who reached the Vajra realm used the energy in their body to borrow the power of the immovable Kunlun. They were invulnerable to weapons and axes. Below celestial phenomenon, the Vajra finger and Xian finger were the same. Li Chungang said that there were as many Vajra realm experts as there were hairs on a cow. He really overestimated the current Jianghu. It was because of His Royal Highness that ordinary people wouldn't be able to see a Vajra realm expert show off their skills. They wouldn't even be able to see a master realm expert who was only a step away from the first grade realm. The arrow drew an arc in the air and went straight for Huang Manor. A martial artist who was proficient in archery would be much more accurate and powerful than an ordinary archer. Xianyuan Jingyi squinted his eyes and waited quietly. The young man couldn't dodge in time and was shot like a porcupine. Hong Piao was born with a short stature. In terms of appearance, he wasn't very eye-catching. He was worlds apart from the head honcho Huang Fengfua. However, Hong Piao was bold and meticulous. He was a typical boorish man who could embroider. Seeing the rain of arrows flying towards him, he said worriedly, "Sir, I heard that old celestial master Zhao secretly took in a disciple. It's the young prince of Bailiang. His martial arts foundation is extraordinary. Could it be this person? If he angered Bailiang Palace and Mount Longhu at the same time, wouldn't there be endless trouble?" Xianyuan Jingyi laughed softly. "You guessed that he's the young prince of Bailiang, but I don't know. Moreover, since he's Zhao Shituan's disciple, he should have some power. Otherwise, do you really think that the Great Bull Gang is like the taverns and tea-houses at the foot of the mountain that you can come and go as you please?" Xianyuan Jingyi and Hong Piao were both stunned. Chapter 306. The flying locusts fell from the sky aggressively. There was no sign of the young man's chi dynamic. He did not dodge and reached out to deflect a few arrows. Those that could not be deflected in time were shot at his body. However, the arrows that were shot at him were all broken as if they hit a metal rock. It was the result of hitting a rock with an egg. A few arrows that were calculated in the direction of the young man's escape hit the ground and created a burst of sparks. It was obvious that the archer's strength was great and the arrow's momentum was fierce. This made the scene even more strange. Since the young man did not use chi dynamic to strengthen his body, how could he deflect those arrows? The guests of Mount Hui who knew their stuff looked at each other in dismay. Huang Fengfo said indifferently, "What a good-born Vajra state. In the past, I only heard the seniors talk about strange things and I did not dare to believe it. Today, I have opened my eyes." At the edge of the guests, there was a handsome man who was waving a fan in autumn. Although he had a pair of peach blossom eyes, there was an evil aura around him. There were more than 10 women painted on the front and back of the fan with their names and families written on it. There were more than 20 words to describe their romance. These women were all under his evil clutches. There were more than 10 fan of beauty and they were all carefully kept. They said that they were to be passed on to their descendants as family heirlooms. This self-proclaimed master of love and painting had been unrestrained in these years. If he had not poisoned a county chief's daughter 2 years ago and completely angered the government, he would not have come to Mount Hui to live under people's skin. The mountain was not as happy as the foot of the mountain. It was true that Mount Hui had beautiful mountains and clear waters and beautiful women, but this land's happiness was exclusive to the direct descendants of Xianyuan. He had been dissatisfied for a long time and complained a lot. This person's reputation was extremely bad. It was hard to imagine that such a perverted thief who everyone wanted to kill could write so many heroic poems that said, "Life is only 100 years, but to scold to one's heart's content for eternity." When he saw the young man who was said to be the heir of Bailiang with a sword, he was quite displeased. There were two kinds of people he hated the most in his life. One was ugly women who would dirty his eyes. The other was men who were more handsome than him. He could ignore the former, but the latter would most likely be tortured by him until they were disabled. The young man's strength was amazing, but he thought about it and saw that the young man's expression was dull and dull. He felt that he was just a brute. He was not afraid of this at all. To be a flower thief, the most important skill was to be able to escape. Therefore, his lightness skill could be ranked at the top of Mount Hui where there were many masters. He felt that staying in Mount Hui was really boring. Some of the beautiful women were divided up and could only be seen but not eaten. It was too annoying. Mount Hui was full of hidden dragons and crouching tigers. Climbing over the wall to pick flowers was no different from suicide. It was better to go down the mountain and out of sight. 2 years had passed and he was almost out of the limelight. It was time for him to reappear in Jianghu. Those juniors who only knew how to secretly use aphrodisiac to ravage women were really a disgrace to him. Flowers were not to be picked like this. The highest level of flower picking was to pick them and enjoy them before planting them back in the pot. This way, they would be more delicate and beautiful than rashly breaking them and losing their vitality. Since he was going down the mountain, he had been eating and drinking well in the bull gang for 2 years. He had to return a favor. Today's situation was tricky. He was sure that many of the guests in Mount Hui were afraid of the king of Bailiang's name and did not dare to make a move. But he was different. Behind the mountain, I don't care if you're the king of heaven or a different surname. Huang Manor turned around and looked at Su Fengnian. After getting permission from his eyes, he started to run. You're not allowed to use such a desperate move like the Overlord's armor removal. If you can't beat us, then run. It's okay to lose face. As long as there's life, there's hope. Sooner or later, we'll be able to get back at you. His Royal Highness turned around and teased Blue Bird. As he spoke, he felt a little regretful. It was a pity that Wen Hua wasn't present. Otherwise, in such a lively scene, he might not be good at fighting, but his scolding skills were definitely at the peak. He could scold people until smoke came out of their 7 orifices. His 18 generations of ancestors, generation after generation, he wouldn't repeat half a word. Su Fengnian, who had learned a lot of verbal skills from the village women, had to admit that he was inferior and was unwilling to admit defeat. That year, when he met Xianyuan Qingfeng, whom he mistakenly thought was Xianyuan Qingfeng, it was nothing more than a fart of 2 debauches refusing to give way to a well-bred young lady. Fighting was nothing more than swallowing the humiliation. But that bastard Wen Hua's mouth was really undisciplined and out of control. He called a dog his father and called her mother. He even spouted nonsense about how her armpit hair had a body odor that could smoke mosquitoes. He even did the vulgar action of taking off his pants and revealing his 2 buttocks in public. Even if Xianyuan Qingfeng was a bodhisattva with a good temper, he would still get angry and beat him up. This time, on this trip to Mount Hui, he didn't have Wen Hua, who was comparable to a land immortal in terms of quarreling skills, to accompany him. Blue Bird held her spear and rushed out. Her figure wasn't as surprising as Huang Manor's. First, it was the foolish youth, then it was the delicate girl. Other than that old god of swords, Li Chungang, this Bailiang prince didn't have any other capable experts. Long Xuanyu followed the rules and asked Xianyuan Jingyi to fight. Almost at the same time, a guest elder with firm and fierce fist techniques also stepped out. Long Yuxuan saw the green-clothed female servant coming over with her spear. Xianyuan Jingyi didn't need him to say anything and signaled Long Yuxuan to deal with that impetuous girl. The youth was handed over to another guest elder to capture. The outcome was decided. Xianyuanjingyi could be considered to have guessed the outcome, but the outcome was already decided on his side.